In this video, we're going to be breaking down one of the most shocking family massacres in American history that detectives still remember as one of the most brutal crimes they ever investigated. Let's get started. First, we got the Setagaya family murders, Japan. On December 31st, 2000, 4 members of the Miyazawa family were found murdered in their Tokyo home. The killer had spent hours in the house after the murders, eating ice cream, using the computer, and leaving behind more evidence than any detective has ever seen in a single case. The Miyazawa family seemed like the perfect picture of happiness as they prepared for the new millennium. Mikio Miyazawa was a 44-year-old marketing professional who worked from home for Interbrand, a major London-based company that helped create branding for huge corporations like Microsoft and Nissan. He was passionate about theater, animation, and puppets, often spending his evenings watching shows or working on creative projects. His wife Yasuko was 41 years old and ran a small tutoring school from their home in the quiet Setagaya district of Tokyo. She was known as a patient and caring teacher who genuinely loved helping children learn. Their neighbors often saw her working in the garden or walking to the local shops with a warm smile. 8-year-old Nina was in 2nd grade and absolutely loved life. She played soccer with the local kids and took ballet lessons twice a week. Her teachers said she had a bright personality that could light up any room. She was always asking questions and making friends wherever she went. 6-year-old Ray was the baby of the family, still in kindergarten, but already showing signs of being just as curious as his older sister. He loved drawing pictures and playing with toy cars on the living room floor, while his father worked at the computer nearby. The family lived in a 2-story house in the Kamisoshigaya neighborhood of Setagaya, which is in the western part of Tokyo. Their home was located right next to what would soon become Soshigaya Park. The area had once been filled with dozens of families, but by late 2000, most of the neighboring houses had been torn down to make room for the new park expansion. This left the Miyazawa house feeling isolated and alone. Only 2 houses remained standing in what used to be a busy residential area. The other house belonged to Yasuko's mother, Haruko, who lived right next door. The 2 families were incredibly close and spent most evenings together. The isolation might have seemed peaceful, but it also meant there were fewer people around to notice if something went wrong. The nearest neighbors were several blocks away, and the construction area behind their house was completely empty after dark. December 30th, 2000, started like any other winter day for the Miyazawa family. They went shopping together at a small arcade near Chitose Karasuyama Station, picking up groceries and maybe a few treats for the upcoming New Year celebration. The family spent the evening eating dinner and watching television together, just like they did most nights. But there had been some strange incidents in the weeks leading up to that fateful night. Mikio had gotten into arguments with some teenagers who were making noise at a nearby skate park. The young men were loud and disrespectful, and Mikio felt it was his duty as a good neighbor to ask them to keep it down. One witness reported seeing Mikio confront members of a Japanese motorcycle gang called the Bosozoku. These groups were known for being rebellious and aggressive, riding their loud bikes through neighborhoods and causing trouble. Mikio was not the type of man to back down from doing what he thought was right. On Christmas Day, just 5 days before the murders, Yasuko told her father-in-law about a strange car that had been parked in front of their house. It was unusual because their quiet street rarely had any visitors, especially cars that would sit there for long periods. 2 days later, on December 27th, witnesses saw a man in his 40s walking around the outside of the Miyazawa house. He seemed to be studying the property, looking at the windows and doors like he was planning something. The next day, December 28th, someone spotted a man dressed in skateboarding clothes at Seijo Gakuinmei Station, which was only a few miles from the Miyazawa home. The man appeared to be in his 20s and had a hip bag slung across his shoulder. These incidents should have been warning signs, but nobody could have imagined what was about to happen. The Miyazawas went to bed that night, thinking they were safe in their own home. They had no idea that someone was watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The evening of December 30th seemed perfectly normal for the Miyazawa family. After their shopping trip earlier in the day, they settled in for a quiet night at home. Mikio was working on his computer in the first-floor study, probably finishing up some marketing projects before the New Year holiday began. Yasuko was likely preparing lessons for her tutoring students or just enjoying some quiet time with the children. 8-year-old Nina may have been playing or doing some light homework, while 6-year-old Ray was getting ready for bed in his small bedroom on the 2nd floor. The house felt warm and safe as the family went through their evening routine. Outside, the construction area behind their home was dark and empty. The skeleton frames of the future park loomed in the shadows, but inside the Miyazawa house, everything felt normal and peaceful. Ray was the first to go to sleep, tucking himself into his bed in the small room right next to the 2nd floor bathroom. His parents probably kissed him goodnight and closed his door, expecting to see his smiling face in the morning. As the night grew later, the rest of the family began preparing for bed. They had no idea that someone was already outside their house, studying the building and looking for a way to get inside. The killer had chosen his entry point carefully. The second-floor bathroom had a window that faced the empty construction area where no one would see him climbing up. The window was small, but not too small for a determined person to squeeze through. Police would later find broken tree branches near the bathroom window, showing that the killer had climbed up using the natural vegetation around the house. He had also damaged the window screen, carefully removing it so he could get inside without making too much noise. The fact that he chose this specific window tells us several things about the killer. He had to be relatively young and athletic to climb up to the second floor. He also had to be familiar with the house layout, suggesting he might have been watching the family for some time. At approximately 11:30 p.m., neighbors would later recall hearing a loud bang coming from the direction of the Miyazawa house. This was probably the sound of the killer breaking in, or possibly the beginning of the violent struggle that was about to unfold. The killer's first target was little Ray, who was sleeping peacefully in his bedroom right next to the bathroom where the intruder entered. The 6-year-old boy had no chance to defend himself or even wake up properly before the killer strangled him to death. This choice tells us something disturbing about the killer's mindset. He could have tried to avoid the children entirely, but instead, he went straight to the most innocent and defenseless victim first. Ray was the only family member who was strangled rather than stabbed, possibly because the killer wanted to keep him quiet while he dealt with the rest of the family. After killing Ray, the killer moved through the house looking for the other family members. He was armed with a sashimi knife that he had purchased the day before from a grocery store in a nearby shopping district. Police were able to trace the knife back to the specific store, but the purchase didn't lead to any useful clues about the killer's identity. The house erupted into chaos as Mikio discovered the intruder. The 4-year-old father tried to fight back, but he was no match for someone who had come prepared for violence. The struggle was fierce and desperate, with Mikio trying to protect his family, even as the killer stabbed him repeatedly. During the fight, the sashimi knife broke under the force of the attack. Part of the blade actually became lodged in Mikio's skull, showing just how vicious the assault had been. The killer was forced to find another weapon to continue his attack. He grabbed a kitchen knife from the Miyazawa family's own cutlery set and used it to finish killing Mikio. The father's body was found at the bottom of the staircase, suggesting he had either been trying to escape or was pushed down the stairs during the struggle. Yasuko and Nina were found together on the second floor, both stabbed multiple times with the kitchen knife. The attack on Yasuko was particularly brutal. When the 10, she was stabbed so many times in the chest and head that her bones were visible through the wounds. It was clear that the killer had been in a frenzy of violence. 8-year-old Nina had also been stabbed repeatedly, showing that the killer made no distinction between adults and children in his murderous rage. The little girl who loved ballet and soccer died trying to stay close to her mother in their final moments. The entire family was dead within about 30 minutes of the killer's entry into their home. But instead of fleeing the scene like most criminals would do, this killer did something that would baffle investigators for decades to come. He decided to stay. After brutally murdering all 4 members of the Miyazawa family, the killer did something that no one expected. Instead of running away as fast as possible, he made himself completely at home in their house for the next several hours. The killer's behavior after the murders was so bizarre that it earned the case a nickname, the Goldilocks Murders. Just like the fairy tale character who made herself comfortable in the 3 Bears house, this killer acted like he owned the place. First, he went to the kitchen and helped himself to food from the refrigerator. He ate 4 small containers of ice cream, wandering around the house as he enjoyed his stolen treats. Police found the empty containers scattered throughout the home, one in the bathtub on the second floor, another on the living room cushions, and 2 more stacked up next to the computer in the first-floor study. The killer also drank 4 bottles of barley tea and ate some melon that he found in the family's kitchen. His saliva was found on the cups and containers, giving police perfect DNA samples that should have led to his identification. But somehow, this evidence has never matched anyone in any database. At 1:18 a.m., roughly an hour or 2 after committing the murders, the killer turned on the family's computer and began browsing the internet. He spent exactly 5 minutes and 18 seconds online, visiting a website that had been bookmarked by Mikio Miyazawa. The website belonged to the Shiki Theater Company, which was particularly cruel since Mikio had been passionate about theater. Whether the killer chose this site as some kind of sick joke or just clicked on it randomly, nobody knows. But it shows the cold, calculating nature of someone who could murder a family and then casually surf the web afterward. During his time in the house, the killer also used the family's bathroom and defecated in their toilet without flushing. This gave investigators another source of DNA evidence, plus information about what the killer had eaten the day before the murders. Analysis of the feces showed that he had consumed string beans and sesame seeds. The killer also took time to treat his own injuries, using medical supplies he found in the house. During the struggle with Mikio, the killer had been cut and was bleeding. He used the family's first aid kit and sanitary products to bandage his wounds, leaving his blood on various items throughout the house. Some reports suggest that the killer even took a nap on the living room sofa during his extended stay in the house. While this cannot be proven definitively, it would fit with his pattern of treating the crime scene like his personal hotel room. Throughout the night, the killer gathered various items belonging to the family. He collected all of their ID cards and credit cards, arranging them neatly in the living room near the sofa. Investigators believe he may have been trying to guess their PIN numbers, though he ultimately left all the cards behind. The killer also assembled a strange collection of garbage and personal items, which he dumped in the bathtub for reasons that remain completely mysterious. This included ice cream wrappers, advertising flyers that had been cut up, some of Mikio's work receipts, Yasuko's school documents, and feminine hygiene products stained with his own blood. Before leaving the house, the killer stole approximately 150,000 yen, about $1,200, in cash that belonged to Yasuko's tutoring business. However, he left behind even more money that was easily visible in Mikio's study, proving that robbery was not his primary motive. The only other item that appeared to be missing was an old jacket that had belonged to Mikio. Everything else in the house was left untouched, including valuable electronics and jewelry that would have been easy to steal. Most importantly, for the investigation, the killer left behind a massive amount of physical evidence. In addition to his DNA and fingerprints throughout the house, he also abandoned several pieces of clothing and personal items. The killer left behind a black sweater that had only gone on sale 2 months before the murders. Police learned that only 130 of these specific sweaters had been manufactured and sold, but they were only able to track down 12 of the people who bought them. The sweater contained traces of bird droppings, Japanese zelkova tree leaves, and willow leaves in the pockets. He also left behind a unique raglan-style shirt with distinctive bloodstains. This shirt was only available in certain marufuru shops and was very popular among young people at the time. Like the sweater, only 130 pieces were ever sold, but police could only identify 12 of the buyers. The killer's shoes were identified through footprints found throughout the house and yard. They were manufactured in South Korea but marketed by the British sports company Slazenger. The size was marked with a Korean size code, and between October 1998 and November 2000, only 4,530 pairs were manufactured in South Korea. Perhaps most intriguingly, the killer left behind a hip bag that contained several important clues about his background. Inside the bag, investigators found 2 strands of hair that may have belonged to the killer. One was black and 2.5 centimeters long, while the other was blackish-brown and only 1.5 millimeters long. Both appeared to have been cut with hair clippers. The bag also contained traces of Drakkar Noir cologne, which was manufactured by Guy Laroche in France. This particular fragrance had been popular among American professional skateboarders in the 1980 seconds, adding to the theory that the killer was involved in skateboard culture. Even more mysterious was the sand found inside the hip bag. Forensic analysis determined that this sand came from 2 different locations. Some of it was from the Miura Peninsula in Japan, but other grains were traced to the Nevada desert, specifically the area around Edwards Air Force Base in California. This discovery was shocking because Edwards Air Force Base is a major training facility for military pilots, many of whom are later stationed in Japan. The sand could have gotten into the bag if the killer had spent time at the base, either as military personnel or as a civilian contractor. The bag also contained a piece of grip tape used on skateboard surfaces, fluorescent red agents normally found in stage production, and soil particles that matched areas around Seoul, South Korea's capital city. All of the killer's clothing had been washed in hard water, which is unusual because Japan uses a soft water system. This suggested that the clothes had been washed outside of Japan, possibly in Korea or the United States where hard water is more common. DNA analysis of the killer's blood revealed even more fascinating details about his background. The killer was male with type A blood, and genetic testing showed that he was likely of mixed race. His maternal DNA indicated that his mother was of European descent, possibly from a country near the Mediterranean or Adriatic Sea. His paternal DNA showed East Asian ancestry. Analysis of the Y chromosome found a genetic sequence that appears in 20-25% of Korean people, but only about 10% of Japanese and Chinese people. This strongly suggested that the killer's father was Korean, though it did not rule out Chinese or Japanese ancestry entirely. The killer was estimated to be between his late teens and mid-20s at the time of the murders, with a thin build and a height of approximately 170 centimeters, about 5 feet 7 inches. He was right-handed and showed no signs of drug use or smoking in his system. One detail that caught investigators' attention was the killer's footprint pattern on the stairs. The prints switched from the wall side to the handrail side, halfway up, which is consistent with military training. This added more weight to the theory that the killer might have had military experience. By the time the killer finally left the Miyazawa house, probably just before dawn on December 31st, he had left behind more physical evidence than most criminals leave in their entire careers. His DNA, fingerprints, clothing, personal items, and even his bodily waste were all available for analysis. Yet somehow, none of this overwhelming evidence has ever led to his identification or arrest. Immediate aftermath. On the morning of December 31st, 2000, Yasuko's mother Haruko tried calling her daughter to make plans for New Year's Day. The phone just rang and rang with no answer. Worried, she walked over to the house next door and rang the doorbell. When nobody answered, she used her own set of keys to let herself in. The scene that greeted Haruko was every parent's worst nightmare. At the bottom of the staircase lay her son-in-law, Mikio, covered in blood and clearly dead from multiple stab wounds. She called out to the rest of the family but heard nothing except the terrible silence of an empty house. Fighting through her shock and horror, Haruko climbed the stairs to the second floor. In the main bedroom, she found her daughter Yasuko and granddaughter Nina, both lying in pools of blood. The injuries were so severe that it was immediately clear they were both dead. In the smaller bedroom next door, Haruko discovered 6-year-old Rei lying peacefully in his bed. Unlike the others, he showed no visible wounds or blood, but he was not breathing. The killer had strangled the little boy while he slept. Haruko immediately called the police at 10:40 a.m. Within minutes, the house was swarming with investigators from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department. What they found was unlike anything they had ever seen in their careers. The crime scene was a treasure trove of physical evidence. The killer's fingerprints were everywhere, on glasses, ice cream containers, door handles, and surfaces throughout the house. His DNA was found in multiple locations, from the blood he had left during the struggle to the saliva on cups he had used. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department launched one of the largest criminal investigations in Japanese history. Chief Takeshi Tsuchida of the Seijo Police Station was put in charge of the case, and over the following months, more than 280,000 police officers would be involved in various aspects of the investigation. The police conducted an operation called Operation Roller, where officers went door to door throughout the neighborhood, collecting fingerprints from local residents. They needed to eliminate all possible sources of prints found in the house to make sure they only focused on evidence left by the killer. Investigators also created a detailed 3D reconstruction of the crime scene and the surrounding neighborhood. They used this to help potential witnesses visualize exactly what they might have seen on the night of December 30th or early morning of December 31st. The massive investigation quickly turned up several interesting witness reports. A taxi driver reported picking up 3 middle-aged men near the Miyazawa house after midnight on December 31st. The men remained completely silent during the entire ride, which the driver found very strange. One of them appeared to be injured and left bloodstains in the back seat. Another witness reported seeing a man hurrying away on a path near the house at around 11:35 p.m. on December 30th, which would have been right around the time the murders were taking place. The police also discovered that someone had disconnected the phone lines to the Miyazawa house, which explained why Haruko couldn't reach her daughter the next morning. This showed that the killer had thought ahead and planned to prevent the family from calling for help. As news of the murders spread, the Japanese public was shocked and horrified. Japan has one of the lowest violent crime rates in the world, and the idea of an entire family being brutally murdered in their own home was almost unthinkable to most citizens. The case received massive media coverage, with newspapers and television stations providing daily updates on the investigation. The bizarre details about the killer staying in the house for hours after the murders fascinated and terrified the public in equal measure. Tips and leads poured in from around the country. Over the following years, police would receive more than 16,000 pieces of information from the public. Every single tip had to be investigated and cross-referenced with the physical evidence from the crime scene. The international aspects of the case led Japanese police to seek help from law enforcement agencies around the world. The sand from Edwards Air Force Base, the mixed-race DNA profile, and the Korean-made shoes all suggested that the killer might not be Japanese or might have connections outside Japan. Police sent DNA samples and fingerprint data to databases in the United States, South Korea, and several European countries. They were hoping to find a match that would finally identify their suspect. But every search came back negative. The investigation also revealed some troubling security issues. The Miyazawa house was isolated and vulnerable, with easy access through the bathroom window. The fact that the killer could spend hours in the house without being detected showed how little protection the family had in their remote location. As weeks turned into months with no arrests, the Japanese public began to lose confidence in the police investigation. Some critics argued that investigators had made mistakes in processing the crime scene or following up on leads. Others wondered whether the international aspects of the case were being handled properly. The unusual DNA profile and the sand from Edwards Air Force Base suggested that the killer might have military connections, but it was unclear whether Japanese police were getting full cooperation from American authorities. The case also raised questions about Japan's relationship with its foreign residents and military personnel. Some people began to wonder whether the killer was someone with diplomatic immunity or special legal protections that made it difficult to arrest him. By the first anniversary of the murders, police had spent millions of dollars on the investigation and interviewed thousands of potential suspects and witnesses. Despite having more physical evidence than most solved cases, they were no closer to making an arrest than they had been on January 1, 2001. Long-term repercussions. The Setagaya family murders had a profound impact that extended far beyond the tragedy itself. The case became a symbol of how even the most advanced forensic science could fail when faced with a truly mysterious killer. One of the most significant changes that resulted from the murders was the abolition of Japan's statute of limitations for serious crimes. Before 2010, even murder cases would eventually be closed if too much time passed without an arrest. But the public outcry over the Setagaya case helped convince lawmakers that some crimes were too serious to ever give up on. The murders also led to improvements in DNA testing and database sharing in Japan. In 2024, the Setagaya Ward Assembly passed a motion calling for expanded use of DNA evidence and better coordination between different law enforcement agencies. Over the years, the investigation consumed enormous resources and manpower. More than 280,000 police officers have been involved in the case at various times, making it one of the largest criminal investigations in world history. The financial cost has run into the millions of dollars, but Japanese authorities have never seriously considered closing the case. The house where the murders took place became a grim landmark in the neighborhood. For years, police maintained a presence there, hoping the killer might return to the scene of his crime. The building gradually deteriorated, and by 2019, police announced plans to demolish it due to safety concerns. The decision to tear down the house was controversial. Some family members and supporters argued that it should be preserved as evidence, while others felt that demolition would finally allow the community to heal and move on. The case has inspired countless theories and speculation from amateur investigators around the world. Internet forums and true crime podcasts regularly revisit the evidence, proposing new suspects and motives. Some of these theories are thoughtful and well-researched, while others border on the ridiculous. One of the most persistent theories involves connections to the United States military. The sand from Edwards Air Force Base, combined with the killer's mixed-race background and possible military training, has led many people to believe he was an American serviceman stationed in Japan. However, this theory faces several challenges. Military personnel are fingerprinted, and their DNA is often on file, so it seems unlikely that such a person could remain unidentified for over 2 decades. Additionally, the movement of military personnel between bases is carefully tracked, making it difficult for someone to simply disappear. Another popular theory suggests that the killer was a North Korean agent or spy. The Korean ancestry shown in the DNA, combined with the sophisticated planning and cold-blooded execution, has led some to speculate about state-sponsored terrorism. However, there's no evidence that the Miyazawa family had any connection to politics or international affairs that would make them targets. The skateboard connection has also generated numerous theories. The killer's clothing, the grip tape in his bag, and the Drakkar Noir cologne all point to someone involved in skateboard culture. Some have suggested that Mikio's confrontations with skateboarders at the nearby park led to revenge, but this seems disproportionate to the crime. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the case is how the abundance of evidence has actually made it harder to solve. With so many clues pointing in different directions, investigators have struggled to develop a coherent theory about the killer's identity and motive. The mixed DNA results could indicate someone of Korean-European ancestry, but they could also represent contamination or testing errors. The sand from Edwards Air Force Base might point to military connections, but it could also have come from a second-hand purchase. The Korean-made shoes suggest time spent in Korea, but they were also sold in Japan. In 2015, true crime author Fumiya Ichihashi published a book claiming to have identified the killer as a former South Korean military member he called R. Ichihashi claimed to have matched fingerprints and traced soil samples to specific Korean locations. However, his theory has not been accepted by police and remains unproven. The case has also highlighted the limitations of international law enforcement cooperation. Despite clear evidence that the killer may have international connections, sharing DNA databases and fingerprint records between countries remains complicated by legal and bureaucratic barriers. Some critics have suggested that certain evidence in the case has been suppressed or inadequately investigated due to diplomatic concerns. The theory that the killer might be connected to U.S. military personnel has led to speculation about whether American authorities have fully cooperated with the Japanese investigation. The victims' families have continued to seek justice and keep the case in the public eye. Mikio's mother, Setsuko Miyazawa, has given interviews and supported efforts to modernize DNA testing techniques. She has never given up hope that her son's killer will eventually be caught. The case has also influenced popular culture in Japan and around the world. It has been featured in countless documentaries, podcasts, books, and television programs. The 2022 podcast Faceless, by author Nicolas Obregon, took a particularly deep dive into the case, interviewing key figures and challenging some commonly accepted theories. Modern forensic techniques continue to offer hope for eventually solving the case. Advances in DNA analysis, facial reconstruction technology, and genetic genealogy have helped solve other cold cases that seemed impossible just a few years ago. In particular, familial DNA searching, ST, which uses genetic databases to identify suspects through their relatives, has proven successful in cases where traditional DNA matching has failed. However, these techniques require large genetic databases and cooperative legal frameworks that may not exist in Japan. The Setagaya murders serve as a reminder that even in our age of advanced forensic science, some mysteries remain unsolved. The killer left behind enough evidence to fill a warehouse, yet somehow managed to vanish without a trace. For the people of Japan, the case represents a fundamental challenge to their sense of safety and security. The idea that someone could commit such a brutal crime and never be caught contradicts their faith in law and order. 24 years after the murders, Japanese police continue to investigate new leads and appeal for public information. Every December 31st, officers hand out flyers near the crime scene, hoping that someone will finally come forward with the information needed to solve the case. The killer, if still alive, would now be in his 40s or 50s. He may have committed other crimes, started a family, or completely changed his life. But somewhere in the world, there is a man who knows exactly what happened in that house on December 30th, 2000. The Miyazawa family deserves justice, and their killer deserves to be held accountable for his crimes. Until that day comes, the Setagaya murders will remain one of the most baffling and disturbing unsolved cases in criminal history. The evidence is there. The DNA is preserved, the fingerprints are clear. All that's missing is the right person seeing this information and recognizing that they know who the killer island. Perhaps that person is reading this story right now. Perhaps they hold the key to finally solving Japan's most mysterious murder case. Perhaps justice for Mikio, Yasuko, Nina, and Rei Miyazawa is closer than anyone realizes. The investigation continues, and hope remains alive. So there you have the Setagaya family murders, AI, a case that left behind more evidence than any detective has ever seen, yet remains completely unsolved after 24 years. The killer's DNA, fingerprints, clothing, and even his feces were all recovered from the scene. Sand from Edwards Air Force Base, Korean-made shoes, and a mixed-race genetic profile painted a clear picture of someone with international connections. But despite 280,000 investigators and 16,000 tips from the public, the man who spent hours eating ice cream and browsing the internet after murdering an entire family has never been found. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the Roden family massacre, Ohio. On April 22, 2016, 8 members of the Roden family were found shot execution-style across 4 homes in Pike County, Ohio. After years of investigation, 4 members of the Wagner family were convicted in what prosecutors called a carefully planned massacre, motivated by a custody dispute over a 2-year-old girl. Contextual overview. Pike County, Ohio, is the kind of place where everybody knows everybody. Rolling hills, farmland, and small communities where families have lived for generations. It's quiet, peaceful, and the last place you would expect to find one of the most brutal family massacres in American history. The Roden family had deep roots in Pike County. Christopher Roden Sr., who everyone called Chris, was 40 years old and worked various jobs to support his family. He was known as a hard-working man who loved his children and would do anything to protect them. Chris had been married to Dana Roden, but they had divorced while still maintaining a friendly relationship for the sake of their kids. Dana Roden was 37 years old and worked as a tutor, helping local children with their schoolwork from her home. She was beloved in the community for her patience and kindness with kids who struggled academically. Despite her divorce from Chris, she remained close to the extended Roden family and lived just down the road from her ex-husband. Chris and Dana had 3 children together. Their oldest son, Clarence, who went by Frankie, was 20 years old and engaged to a sweet young woman named Hannah Gilly. Frankie was planning to start his own family and had dreams of building a life in Pike County like his father had done. Their daughter Hannah was 19 years old and had already experienced more than most teenagers. She had given birth to her first child when she was just 15, a daughter named Sophia, with a young man named Edward Wagner, who everyone called Jake. The relationship between Hannah and Jake had been complicated from the start, partly because he was 18 when she was only 13 and they began dating. Hannah had recently given birth to her second child, a baby girl who was only 5 days old when the murders took place. This new baby had a different father than Sophia, which had caused tension with Jake Wagner and his family. The Wagners wanted full custody of Sophia and were not happy about Hannah moving on with her life. The youngest Roden child was Christopher Jr., who everyone called Chris Jr. He was just 16 years old, a typical teenager who loved spending time with his family and had his whole life ahead of him. The extended Roden family was close-knit. Chris Sr.'s brother Kenneth was 44 years old and lived nearby in his own trailer. Kenneth was known as a gentle man who stayed out of trouble and worked hard to make an honest living. Their cousin Gary Roden was 38 years old and also lived in the area, maintaining the strong family bonds that characterized the Roden clan. Hannah Gilly, Frankie's 20-year-old fiancée, had become like a daughter to the Roden family. She was planning to marry Frankie and was excited about their future together. Hannah was nursing their 6-month-old baby boy and looking forward to officially joining the family that had welcomed her with open arms. The Roden family lived in mobile homes scattered across the rural landscape of Pike County. 3 of the homes were located on Union Hill Road, close enough that family members could easily visit each other. The 4th home, where Kenneth lived, was about 8 miles away in the nearby town of Piketon. Life in Pike County moved at a slower pace than in big cities. People left their doors unlocked, children played outside until dark, and neighbors looked out for each other. The idea that someone could methodically hunt down and execute an entire family was almost unthinkable in this quiet corner of Ohio. But there was one family that had been watching the Rodens very carefully. The Wagner family had money, land, and a reputation for getting what they wanted. George Billy Wagner III was the patriarch, a man in his early 50s who owned considerable property and had raised his sons to believe that the Wagner name meant something in Pike County. Billy's wife Angela was known for being extremely protective of her 2 sons and their children. Some people in town described her as obsessive when it came to controlling her family members and their relationships. She had strong opinions about who her sons should date and how their children should be raised. The Wagner sons were George IV, who was 27 at the time, and Jake, who was 26. Both young men had been raised to view themselves as superior to their neighbors and to take what they believed belonged to them. Jake had fathered Sophia with Hannah Roden, and the Wagner family considered the little girl to be their property as much as their granddaughter. The custody battle over Sophia had been building for months before the murders. Hannah Roden wanted to move away from Pike County with her new boyfriend and both of her children. The Wagner family saw this as an unacceptable threat to their access to Sophia, whom they viewed as the continuation of their family line. What started as a typical family dispute over custody and visitation was about to escalate into something far more sinister. The Wagner family had resources, connections, and a willingness to do whatever it took to maintain control over what they considered theirs. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock Pike County and the entire nation, but nobody could have imagined just how far the Wagner family was willing to go to get what they wanted. The tension between the Roden and Wagner families had been building for more than a year before the murders took place. Jake Wagner and Hannah Roden's relationship had started when she was just 13 years old and he was 18, which should have raised red flags from the beginning. When Hannah became pregnant at 15, the Wagner family initially seemed supportive, but their true nature began to emerge after Sophia was born. Angela Wagner, Jake's mother, became obsessively involved in the custody arrangements for her granddaughter. She wanted to control every aspect of Sophia's life, from where she lived to who could spend time with her. Former family members would later testify that Angela treated all the grandchildren like her own children, sometimes keeping them overnight when their parents wanted them home. The problems got worse when Hannah started dating someone new and became pregnant with her second child. The Wagner family saw this as a betrayal and began pressuring Hannah to give them full custody of Sophia. They offered money and made threats, but Hannah refused to give up her daughter. Court documents would later reveal that the Wagner family had actually forged custody papers to try to gain legal control over Sophia. They were willing to commit fraud rather than go through the proper legal channels to resolve their dispute with Hannah. Throughout 2015 and early 2016, the Wagner family began making elaborate preparations for what they claimed was their plan to move to Alaska. They sold their property on Peterson Road in Pike County and told neighbors they were leaving Ohio permanently. But investigators would later discover that this move was actually part of a carefully planned cover story for the murders. In the months leading up to the massacre, the Wagner family began purchasing unusual items that would later be connected to the killings. Angela Wagner bought 2 pairs of gray athletic shoes at the local Walmart, one in size 10.5 and another in size 11. These shoes would leave footprints at all 4 crime scenes. The family also purchased ammunition, magazine clips, and something called brass catchers, devices that attach to firearms to collect shell casings so they cannot be left behind as evidence. They bought bug detection equipment to scan for surveillance devices and phone jammers to block communications during the attacks. Perhaps most disturbing, the Wagner family spent considerable time studying the Roden family's daily routines and habits. They knew when each family member went to bed, when they woke up, and how their homes were laid out. This level of surveillance showed that the murders were planned weeks or even months in advance. Jake and George Wagner IV both dyed their hair in the week before the murders, apparently trying to change their appearance in case they were spotted by witnesses. They had also constructed a homemade silencer to muffle the sound of their gunshots, though it proved ineffective during the actual attacks. The Wagner family studied what they called counter-surveillance methods, learning about the Roden family's security cameras and even their pets. They knew which dogs might bark during an attack and how to disable phone lines and cameras to prevent evidence from being collected. On April 21, 2016, the Wagner family made their final preparations. Phone records would later show unusual calling patterns between family members throughout that day, as they coordinated their movements and confirmed their plans. The calls continued late into the evening as the family prepared to execute their carefully planned massacre. The Wagner family knew that the Roden children would be in their homes that night. They knew that 5-day-old baby was nursing and that Sophia would be staying with her mother. They knew the layout of each trailer and which family members would be in which rooms. What the Wagner family seemed to believe was that they could eliminate all the adult Rodens and then claim custody of the surviving children, including Sophia. Their plan was not just murder, it was what prosecutors would later call family annihilation, designed to remove anyone who might interfere with their custody goals. As the sun set on April 21, 2016, the Wagner family was putting the finishing touches on a plan that had been months in the making. They had weapons, they had detailed knowledge of their targets, and they had convinced themselves that mass murder was justified to gain control over a 2-year-old girl. The Roden family, meanwhile, had no idea what was coming. They went about their evening routines, put their children to bed, and settled in for what they thought would be a quiet night in their peaceful Pike County community. The attack began in the early morning hours of April 22, 2016. Jake Wagner would later confess that he and his family arrived at the first location around midnight, armed with multiple weapons, and wearing the gray athletic shoes that Angela had purchased. They moved through the darkness with military-style precision, hitting each location in a carefully planned sequence. The first target was the trailer where Chris Roden Sr. and his cousin Gary were staying on Union Hill Road. The killers entered the home quietly, catching both men while they slept. Chris was shot multiple times in the head, torso, and limbs, suggesting he may have tried to fight back when he realized what was happening. Gary was also shot multiple times, killed execution style in his bed. The brutality was immediate and overwhelming. The attackers fired an estimated 32 shots total across all 4 crime scenes, showing that this was not a quick, merciful killing but a sustained assault designed to make sure no one survived. From the first trailer, the killers moved to a second mobile home just a short distance away on the same property. This was where Frankie Roden and his fiancée Hannah Gilly were living with their 6-month-old baby boy. The young couple had been sleeping when the attackers entered their home. Frankie was shot multiple times and killed in his bed. Hannah Gilly, who had been nursing their baby, was also shot execution style. Jake Wagner would later testify that he positioned Hannah's body after shooting her so she could continue nursing the infant, whose life was spared. The image of a murdered mother arranged to feed her surviving baby shows the cold calculation behind these killings. The killers collected shell casings and cell phones as they moved between locations, trying to eliminate evidence that could be traced back to them. However, they missed one shell casing under the baby's crib, which would later help investigators connect the crimes to weapons found at Wagner properties. The third location was Dana Roden's trailer, also on Union Hill Road. Dana was shot in the head and neck while in her bed. Her 6-year-old son, Christopher Jr., was found in a nearby room, also shot multiple times. The fact that the killers murdered a sleeping teenager shows that age made no difference to them. Anyone old enough to potentially testify had to die. At Dana's house, the killers spared her youngest son, a 3-year-old boy who was found unharmed but crying in his crib. The selective nature of who lived and died was chilling. Babies and toddlers survived, but anyone old enough to be a witness was eliminated. The final location was Kenneth Roden's camper in Piketon, about 8 miles away from the other crime scenes. Kenneth was Chris Sr.'s brother, and he was shot to death in his bed. The fact that the killers drove 8 miles to a separate location to murder Kenneth shows the systematic nature of their plan. To a T, they were determined to eliminate every adult male in the Roden family. Most of the victims were shot in the head, some multiple times. The autopsy reports, which were heavily redacted due to the ongoing investigation, revealed that some victims showed signs of bruising, indicating they may have been beaten before being shot. This added cruelty suggests that the killers were not just trying to eliminate witnesses but were taking satisfaction in the violence. The execution-style nature of the killings was particularly disturbing to investigators. Most of the victims were shot while lying in their beds, suggesting they were killed while sleeping or immediately after being awakened. There were no signs that the victims had time to defend themselves or escape. After the killings, the Wagner family attempted to create alibis and destroy evidence. They burned items in barrels on their property and disposed of weapons in remote locations. The family had planned not just the murders, but also the cover-up, showing the premeditated nature of their crimes. Jake Wagner later admitted to personally shooting 5 of the 8 victims. He described the killings in chilling detail during his testimony, explaining how he and his family moved from house to house like a military unit, communicating through cell phones and coordinating their movements. The surviving children were left traumatized but physically unharmed. Sophia, the 2-year-old at the center of the custody dispute, was found crying in her crib next to her murdered mother. The 5-day-old baby was discovered still nursing from her dead mother, a scene that haunted first responders for years afterward. The crime scenes were contained but horrific. Investigators found blood spatter, shell casings, and footprints throughout the homes. The killers had tried to be methodical, but the sheer violence of the attacks left behind extensive physical evidence that would eventually lead to their identification and conviction. What struck investigators most was the level of planning and coordination required to execute such an attack. The killers knew exactly where to go, when to arrive, and how to move between locations without being detected. They had studied their targets so thoroughly that they could navigate the properties in darkness and locate sleeping victims with precision. The Wagner family's plan was not just to commit murder, but to reshape an entire community's understanding of what was possible in their peaceful rural county. The idea that neighbors could plan and execute such a systematic massacre challenged everything the people of Pike County believed about safety and trust in their small community. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came at 7:51 a.m. on April 22, 2016, when Bobby Jo Manley made a frantic 911 call. She was Dana Roden's sister and had come by that morning to feed the family's pets and check on everyone. What she found in the first trailer would haunt her for the rest of her life. "I think my brother-in-law is dead," Manley told the 911 dispatcher, her voice shaking with shock and horror. She had discovered the bodies of Chris Roden Sr. and Gary Roden, both shot multiple times in their beds. The scene was so brutal that she could barely process what she was seeing. Before police arrived, Manley and a friend checked the second trailer on the property and made an even more devastating discovery. Frankie Roden and Hannah Gilley were also dead, their bodies riddled with bullets. Most disturbing was the sight of Hannah still positioned as if she was nursing her baby, who was found alive but covered in his mother's blood. Manley immediately called her brother James, who rushed to check on their sister Dana at her nearby trailer. When police arrived at Dana's home, they found 3 more victims: Dana herself, shot in the head and neck, and her 6-year-old son Christopher Jr., also shot multiple times. Miraculously, Dana's 3-year-old son was found alive and unharmed in his room. The 4th and final victim was discovered at 1:26 p.m. when another 911 call reported finding Kenneth Roden dead in his camper 8 miles away in Piketon. The scattered locations and execution-style nature of the killings immediately told investigators they were dealing with something far more sophisticated than a typical rural crime. Pike County Sheriff Charles Reeder arrived at the scenes and quickly realized his department was facing the largest murder investigation in the county's history. Within hours, more than 100 law enforcement officers from multiple agencies had descended on Pike County, including agents from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation and the FBI. The Ohio Attorney General's office took control of the investigation due to its scope and complexity. Attorney General Mike DeWine, who would later become governor, called it a sophisticated operation and warned that the killers were still at large and potentially dangerous. The community reaction was immediate and intense. Pike County residents were advised to lock their doors and stay inside their homes until the killers could be identified. Many people had never locked their doors before, but the massacre shattered the sense of security that had defined rural Ohio life for generations. The investigation quickly revealed disturbing details about the crime scenes. Investigators found evidence of marijuana cultivation at some of the Roden properties, leading to initial speculation that the murders might be connected to drug cartels. However, this theory was eventually dismissed as investigators realized the killings were far too personal and targeted to be cartel-related. The presence of cockfighting equipment at one of the properties also generated theories about gambling debts or rural organized crime. But again, the systematic nature of the killings and the fact that children were spared suggested something more personal than business disputes. What immediately struck investigators was the amount of physical evidence left behind. Unlike many professional killings, the Pike County massacre left behind footprints, shell casings, and other forensic evidence at multiple crime scenes. The killers had tried to be careful, but the scope of their attack made it impossible to eliminate all traces. The surviving children became immediate concerns for law enforcement and social services. Sophia, the 2-year-old at the center of what investigators suspected was a custody dispute, was placed in protective custody. The other surviving children were also removed from the area for their own safety, while investigators tried to determine who might want to harm the Roden family. The crime scenes were so extensive that investigators had to move the mobile homes to a secure location to properly process all the evidence. The homes were loaded onto trucks and transported to a facility where forensics experts could examine every surface for clues about the killers' identities. Within days of the murders, investigators had interviewed more than 50 people and executed at least 5 search warrants. They were following up on hundreds of tips from the public, including many false leads and conspiracy theories that diverted resources from the actual investigation. The media attention was overwhelming. News crews from across the country descended on Pike County to cover what was being called one of the most shocking family massacres in recent American history. The coverage put additional pressure on investigators to solve the case quickly, while also making it harder to keep important details confidential. One of the biggest challenges facing investigators was the rural nature of Pike County itself. Cell phone towers were sparse, making it difficult to track the movements of suspects through phone data. The scattered population meant fewer potential witnesses, and the tight-knit community's suspicion of outsiders made some residents reluctant to share information with investigators from state and federal agencies. Sheriff Reeder issued public statements urging anyone with information to come forward, even going so far as to threaten arrests for anyone obstructing the investigation. The pressure was enormous. 8 people were dead, children were traumatized, and an entire community was living in fear while the killers remained free. Long-term repercussions. The Pike County Massacre investigation became one of the largest and most expensive in Ohio history, consuming millions of dollars and involving hundreds of law enforcement officers over more than 2 years. The case fundamentally changed how rural Ohio communities viewed their own safety and security. For more than 2 years, the investigation seemed to be going nowhere. Investigators followed thousands of leads, interviewed hundreds of people, and collected mountains of evidence, but no arrests were made. The Wagner family had moved to Alaska shortly after the murders, claiming they were afraid for their safety, which initially made them seem like potential victims rather than suspects. The breakthrough came when investigators were able to connect ballistic evidence from the crime scenes to weapons that had been fired at the Wagner family's Peterson Road property. This connection, combined with the matching footprints from shoes Angela Wagner had purchased, finally gave investigators the probable cause they needed to focus on the Wagner family as suspects. Cell phone records showed suspicious calling patterns between Wagner family members on the day of the murders. Surveillance footage from the purchases of shoes and ammunition created a timeline of preparation that pointed directly to premeditation. The Wagner family's own careful planning had created the evidence trail that would ultimately convict them. On November 13, 2018, more than 2 years after the massacre, All 4 Wagner family members were arrested and charged with the murders. Jake and Angela Wagner were arrested in Ohio, while George Wagner IV was taken into custody in Kentucky. Billy Wagner was arrested at his workplace, ending one of the longest manhunts in Ohio history. The arrests sent shockwaves through Pike County and the broader Ohio community. Many residents had suspected the Wagner family's involvement, but others were genuinely surprised that neighbors they had known for years were capable of such brutality. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and drawn out. Jake Wagner eventually pleaded guilty to all charges and agreed to testify against his family members in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. His confession provided chilling details about the planning and execution of the murders that had haunted investigators for years. Angela Wagner also took a plea deal, admitting her role in planning the murders and purchasing the equipment used in the attacks. Her cooperation helped prosecutors build their cases against her husband and older son, but it also revealed the extent to which the entire family had been involved in the conspiracy. George Wagner IV chose to go to trial, maintaining his innocence despite testimony from his mother and brother that he had been an active participant in planning and covering up the murders. After a lengthy trial, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Billy Wagner, the family patriarch, was the last to face trial. His case was delayed multiple times due to legal complications and the COVID-19 pandemic. As of 2024, he remains in custody awaiting his day in court, still maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his involvement. The custody of Sophia, the little girl whose disputed custody had allegedly motivated the entire massacre, became an ongoing legal battle. She was placed in the care of Scioto County Children's Services and eventually adopted by a family outside of Pike County, far from the violence that had claimed her mother's life. The surviving children from the crime scenes required years of therapy and support to deal with the trauma of losing their families and witnessing such violence. The community also struggled with collective trauma, knowing that people they had trusted and lived alongside were capable of such calculated brutality. The case led to changes in Ohio law enforcement procedures for handling complex, multi-jurisdictional murder cases. The coordination between local, state, and federal agencies became a model for other states dealing with similar crimes. The investigation also highlighted the dangers of domestic violence and custody disputes escalating to deadly extremes. The Wagner family's obsession with controlling Sophia and their willingness to murder 8 people to achieve that control became a cautionary tale about the intersection of family dysfunction and violence. Pike County itself struggled to recover from the massacre. Property values declined in the area around the crime scenes, and many families moved away rather than continue living in a place associated with such horror. The tight-knit community that had once defined rural Ohio life was forever changed by the knowledge that such evil could emerge from within their own midst. The financial cost of the investigation and trials exceeded $10 million, making it one of the most expensive criminal cases in Ohio history. The emotional and psychological costs to the survivors, the community, and law enforcement officers involved were immeasurable. Media coverage of the case continued for years, with documentaries, podcasts, and books examining every aspect of the crimes and investigation. The Pike County Massacre joined a grim list of American family annihilation cases that capture public attention because of their combination of domestic intimacy and extreme violence. The case also raised questions about the effectiveness of the child custody system in preventing such tragedies. The Wagner family's willingness to forge custody documents and ultimately commit mass murder rather than work through legal channels highlighted the need for better interventions in high-conflict custody disputes. Today, Pike County remains haunted by the memory of April 22, 2016. Memorial sites mark the locations where the Roden family members were murdered, and the community continues to struggle with questions about how such violence could have been prevented. The Wagner family members who were convicted continue to appeal their sentences and maintain various levels of responsibility for the crimes. Jake Wagner's cooperation with prosecutors has created ongoing controversy, with some viewing him as a key witness for justice while others see him as a manipulative killer trying to minimize his own responsibility. The investigation files from the Pike County Massacre fill dozens of boxes and represent thousands of hours of police work. The case became a textbook example of how modern forensic techniques, cell phone data analysis, and coordinated law enforcement efforts can solve even the most complex crimes. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Pike County Massacre is the way it changed how rural American communities think about trust and safety. The idea that a neighboring family could spend months planning the systematic murder of 8 people challenged fundamental assumptions about small-town life and the people who share these close-knit communities. The Roden family members who died, Chris Sr., Dana, Frankie, Hannah, Christopher Jr., Hannah Gilly, Kenneth, and Gary, are remembered not just as victims of a horrific crime, but as people who loved their families and were building lives in the place they called home. Their deaths serve as a reminder that domestic violence and family conflicts can escalate to unimaginable extremes when left unchecked. The Pike County Massacre stands as one of the most complex and disturbing family annihilation cases in American history, a crime that shocked a peaceful community and revealed the depths of human cruelty hidden behind the facade of a typical rural family. Justice may have been served through the courts, but the scars left by that terrible night in April 2016 will remain in Pike County for generations to come. So there you have the Roden Family Massacre, ATR, a case that showed how a simple custody dispute could escalate into the systematic execution of 8 family members. The Wagner family spent months planning their attack, purchasing special shoes, ammunition, and even brass catchers to collect shell casings. They studied the Roden family's routines, dyed their hair, and moved through Pike County like a military unit, killing anyone old enough to be a witness while sparing the babies and toddlers. After more than 2 years of investigation involving hundreds of officers and millions of dollars, 4 Wagner family members were arrested and convicted in what prosecutors called one of the most complex murder cases in Ohio history. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the McStay family murders, California. On February 4, 2010, the McStay family of 4 vanished without a trace from their California home. 3 years later, their bodies were discovered buried in shallow graves in the Mojave Desert, and business associate Charles Merritt was convicted of bludgeoning them to death with a sledgehammer. Fallbrook, California, is known as the Friendly Village. Located in northern San Diego County, it's the kind of peaceful community where families put down roots and children grow up safe. In early 2010, the McStay family had recently moved to this quiet town, ready to start a new chapter in their lives. Joseph McStay was 40 years old and living the American dream. He owned and operated Earth-inspired products, a successful business that specialized in custom decorative water fountains. Joseph had built his company from the ground up, creating beautiful indoor fountains for homes and businesses across Southern California. He was known as a hard-working entrepreneur who took pride in his craftsmanship and treated his customers fairly. Joseph's wife, Summer, was 43 years old and worked as a licensed real estate agent. She was described by everyone who knew her as a loving mother and devoted wife who put her family first. Summer had a warm personality and was always willing to help friends and neighbors with whatever they needed. The couple shared 2 young children who were the center of their world. 4-year-old Gianni was full of energy and curiosity, always asking questions and exploring everything around him. His little brother, 3-year-old Joseph Jr., who everyone called Joey, was just learning to talk in full sentences and loved playing with toy cars and trucks. The McStays had recently purchased a home on Avocado Vista Lane in Fallbrook, and they were in the middle of renovating it into their dream house. The walls were freshly painted, with blue painter's tape still marking the corners and newspapers covering the floors to protect them during construction. The house looked more like a work site than a family home, but Joseph and Summer could see its potential. They had moved in just 4 months earlier, in October 2009, and were slowly making the space their own. Summer was passionate about interior design and had big plans for decorating each room. Joseph was handling the business side of their fountain company from a home office, while Summer balanced her real estate work with taking care of the boys. The family had 2 beloved dogs, Bear and Digger, who were constant companions to the children. The dogs spent most of their time in the backyard, playing with Gianni and Joey when the weather was nice. Summer made sure the dogs were fed and cared for every single day without fail. Financially, the McStays were doing well. Joseph's fountain business was thriving, and he had nearly $100,000 in his bank accounts. Summer's real estate work provided additional income, and they were comfortable enough to afford their mortgage and renovation costs without stress. They had no major debts or financial problems that would cause them to worry about money. Joseph worked closely with several business associates to fulfill orders for his custom fountains. One of his key partners was a man named Charles Merritt, who everyone called Chase. Merritt was a welder and fabricator who helped Joseph create the metal components for the more elaborate fountain designs. Chase Merritt was in his late 50s and had been working with Joseph for several years. He was known for his welding skills, but he also had a criminal history that included convictions for burglary and receiving stolen property. His most recent felony conviction, in 2001, was for stealing more than $30,000 worth of welding and drilling equipment from a business in Monrovia. Despite Merritt's past, Joseph had given him opportunities to work and earn money through Earth-inspired products. Joseph believed in second chances and was willing to overlook someone's criminal history if they could do good work and help his business grow. However, the relationship between Joseph and Merritt had become strained in recent months. Joseph had been complaining to friends and family members about Merritt's work quality, saying that he was doing sloppy jobs and missing deadlines. There were also concerns that Merritt might be taking money from the business without permission. Joseph owed Merritt more than $42,000 for work that had been completed in 2009. But Joseph was holding back payment because he was unhappy with the quality. This created tension between the two men, especially since Merritt had serious financial problems of his own. What Joseph and his family did not know was that Merritt had developed a serious gambling problem. He was spending thousands of dollars at local casinos, often losing more money than he could afford. The gambling had put him in desperate financial straits, and he needed Joseph to pay him the money he was owed. The situation became more complicated when Joseph began talking about cutting Merritt out of future projects. Joseph had told friends that he was thinking about finding a new fabricator who could do better work and be more reliable. For Merritt, losing Joseph's business would mean losing his primary source of income. As February 2010 began, the McStay family was looking forward to the future. They had plans to finish renovating their home and maybe take a family vacation once the work was done. Joseph was excited about some new fountain projects, and Summer was helping clients find their perfect homes. But someone close to the family was making very different plans that would turn the peaceful community of Fallbrook into the center of one of California's most baffling missing persons cases. February 4, 2010, started like any other Thursday for the McStay family. Joseph woke up early to check his emails and make phone calls for his fountain business. He spoke with his father, Patrick McStay, and mentioned that he was in a hurry because he had an important lunch meeting scheduled for that day. Summer spent the morning taking care of the boys and working on some real estate paperwork. She called her sister to catch up and talk about her sister's new baby. It was the kind of normal family conversation that families have every day, talking about children and plans for the weekend. Around midday, Joseph left the house to meet with Charles Merritt at a Chick-fil, a restaurant in Rancho Cucamonga. This meeting was supposed to be about business, BR, going over money details, and discussing future projects. Joseph had been putting off this conversation, but he knew it needed to happen. According to Merritt's later statements to police, they spent more than an hour together, discussing various business matters. Merritt claimed that the meeting was friendly and that there were no problems or arguments between them. He said Joseph seemed normal and there was nothing unusual about their conversation. However, friends and family members later said that Joseph had been planning to tell Merritt that he would no longer be using his services. Joseph had found Merritt's work to be increasingly unreliable, and he was tired of dealing with the quality issues and missed deadlines. After the lunch meeting, Joseph returned home to his family. Someone at the house called Joseph's cell phone around 4:25 p.m., though it's unclear who made that call or why. Between 5 p.m. and 5:47 p.m., Joseph and Summer exchanged several text messages, but the content of those messages has never been revealed by investigators. At 5:47 p.m., all communication from the McStay family stopped. Summer's last text message was sent at that time, and after that moment, no one heard from any member of the family again. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. That evening, at 7:47 p.m., a neighbor's security camera captured something important. The video showed the bottom 18 inches of a vehicle leaving the McStay family's driveway. The camera angle was too low to see who was in the vehicle or even to clearly identify what type of car it was, but investigators later believed it was the family's 1996 Isuzu Trooper. The timing was significant because it meant that whoever was driving the vehicle was leaving the house just about 2 hours after the last text message from Summer. The surveillance video would later become a key piece of evidence, even though it raised more questions than it answered. At 8:28 p.m., Joseph's cell phone was used to make a call to Charles Merritt. The call went to voicemail, and Merritt later told police that he ignored it because he was at home watching a movie. Joseph's cell phone pinged a tower in Fallbrook when the call was made, indicating that the phone was still in the area. This would be the last known activity from Joseph's phone. After 8:28 p.m. on February 4, 2010, there were no more calls, no more text messages, and no more communication from any member of the McStay family. Over the next several days, relatives and friends of the McStays tried repeatedly to contact the family. Phone calls went unanswered, text messages were not returned, and emails received no response. At first, people assumed the family might be busy with renovation work or maybe taking a short trip somewhere. But as days passed without any word from Joseph, Summer, or the children, concern began to grow. Joseph was known for staying in regular contact with his father and brother, and Summer always talked to her sister at least a few times a week. Their silence was completely out of character. On February 8th, 4 days after the family's last communication, their Isuzu Trooper was found in a parking lot near the U.S.-Mexico border in San Ysidro. The vehicle had been towed as an abandoned car, but nobody had reported the family missing yet, so the connection was not immediately made. The location where the car was found was significant because it was only about 2 blocks from the pedestrian border crossing into Mexico. This discovery would later lead investigators to theorize that the family might have voluntarily crossed into Mexico, though that theory would eventually be proven wrong. On February 10th, a San Diego County Sheriff's deputy performed a welfare check at the McStay residence after receiving a request from concerned family members. The deputy knocked on the door and looked around the property but found no signs of the family. There were also no obvious signs of foul play or forced entry. 3 days later, on February 13th, Joseph's brother, Michael McStay, decided to take matters into his own hands. He drove to Fallbrook and found an open window at the back of the house. Michael climbed through the window to search for his brother's family, hoping to find some clue about where they might have gone. What Michael found inside the house was deeply troubling. The family's 2 dogs, Bear and Digger, were in the backyard and had not been fed for days. Inside the house, there was rotting food on the kitchen counter, including a carton of eggs that had been left out. There were 2 small bowls of popcorn in the living room that looked like they had been abandoned in the middle of being eaten. The house looked like the family had left suddenly, possibly in the middle of their evening routine. There were no suitcases missing, no clothes packed, and no indication that they had planned to go anywhere. Summer's purse and sunglasses were still in the house, and there was no evidence that they had taken any money or prepared for a trip. Most significantly, the family dogs had been left behind without food or water. Anyone who knew the McStays understood that they would never abandon their beloved pets. Summer made sure the dogs were fed every single day, and the idea that she would leave them to starve was completely unthinkable. On February 15th, Michael McStay officially reported his brother's family missing to the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. Deputies conducted a more thorough search of the house and surrounding area, but found no signs of violence or forced entry. The house was processed as a potential crime scene, but there was no blood or evidence of a struggle. By February 19th, detectives had obtained search warrants for the house, cars, and computers. They were looking for any clue that might explain what had happened to the family or where they might have gone. The investigation was about to take a turn that would confuse everyone involved for the next 3 years. The investigation into the McStay family's disappearance quickly became one of the most puzzling cases that San Diego County detectives had ever handled. The family had simply vanished without leaving behind any clear evidence of what had happened to them or where they had gone. When investigators searched the family's computers, they made a discovery that seemed to support the theory that the McStays had left voluntarily. Someone had used the computers to search for information about traveling to Mexico with children. The searches included queries like, "What documents do children need for traveling to Mexico?" and other travel-related information. The family's computer also showed that someone had recently ordered Spanish language learning materials. This seemed to suggest that the McStays might have been planning a trip to Mexico, though family members insisted that Joseph and Summer had never expressed any interest in traveling there. In fact, relatives said that Joseph and Summer actively avoided Mexico because of safety concerns related to drug cartel violence in border areas. Joseph's father, Patrick, later told reporters, "Why would my son, as smart as he was, take his family to a place that is so wildly dangerous right now?" Despite these concerns from family members, the discovery of the family's SUV near the Mexican border gave investigators a working theory. They believed that the McStays might have crossed into Mexico voluntarily, possibly to start a new life or escape some unknown problem. On March 5, 2010, authorities released surveillance video that seemed to support this theory. The video, taken at the pedestrian border crossing into Mexico, showed a family of 4 walking hand in hand across the border on February 8th. The quality was poor, and the faces were not clearly visible, but the figures appeared to match the approximate ages and sizes of the McStay family members. Based on this evidence, the San Diego Sheriff's Department officially concluded in April 2013 that the McStay family had voluntarily traveled to Mexico. The case was handed over to the FBI, and the search shifted to international locations. For more than 3 years, this remained the official explanation for the family's disappearance. However, several facts about the case never made sense with the voluntary departure theory. The McStays had more than $100,000 in bank accounts, but no money had been withdrawn in preparation for a trip. Summer's passport was expired, making international travel difficult. The family had made no arrangements for their dogs or their house. Most importantly, Joseph and Summer had scheduled a painter to finish work at their house the weekend after they disappeared. Why would they make such arrangements if they were planning to leave the country permanently? Family members and friends continued to reject the Mexico theory, but without any evidence of foul play, there was little they could do to change the official investigation. The McStay family became one of thousands of missing persons cases that remain unsolved each year. The truth about what really happened to the McStays would remain hidden for nearly 4 years, until a chance discovery in the California desert changed everything about the case. On November 11, 2013, an off-road motorcyclist was riding trails in the Mojave Desert near Victorville when he spotted something unusual partially buried in the sand. What he had found was a small human skull that appeared to belong to a child. The motorcyclist immediately contacted the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. When investigators arrived at the remote desert location, they began carefully excavating the area around where the skull had been found. What they discovered was far more extensive than anyone had expected. There were 2 shallow graves containing the skeletal remains of 4 people, 2 adults and 2 children. The graves were labeled Grave A and Grave B by investigators. The remains were carefully removed and transported to the coroner's office for identification. After several days of forensic analysis, dental records confirmed what everyone had feared. The bodies belonged to Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr. McStay. The condition of the remains told a horrific story. All 4 family members had died from blunt force trauma to their heads. Joseph had been struck multiple times, and an electrical cord was wrapped around his neck. He also had a broken rib and a broken leg, suggesting a violent struggle. Summer's skull was badly fractured from multiple impacts. 4-year-old Gianni had suffered at least 7 separate blows to his head. The injuries were so severe that investigators immediately knew this was not an accident or a crime of passion, and it was a deliberate and brutal murder. Buried alongside the bodies was a 3-pound sledgehammer that investigators believed was the murder weapon. The sledgehammer was rusty from being buried in the desert for nearly 4 years, but it was clearly the tool that had been used to bludgeon the family to death. Also found at the scene were some items of children's clothing, including a pair of blue pants and diapers that belonged to one of the boys. The killer had apparently thrown these items into the graves, along with the bodies, before covering everything with dirt and sand. The location where the bodies were found was significant. The graves were in a remote area of the Mojave Desert, about 100 miles north of the McStay family's home in Fallbrook. It was an isolated location that would have been difficult to find without specific knowledge of the area. The discovery of the bodies immediately transformed the case from a missing persons investigation into a quadruple homicide. The San Diego Sheriff's Department, which had spent 3 years believing the family was in Mexico, suddenly had to completely rethink everything they thought they knew about the case. Investigators began reviewing all the evidence from the original disappearance with fresh eyes. They re-examined phone records, financial documents, and witness statements, looking for clues that might lead them to the killer. The focus of the investigation shifted to people who had been close to the family and might have had motives to harm them. Charles Merritt, who had been the last known person to see Joseph alive, became a person of interest in the murder investigation. Detectives began looking more closely at his relationship with Joseph and the financial disputes between the 2 men. When investigators reviewed recordings of their early interviews with Merritt, they noticed something that had not seemed significant at the time. During conversations that took place just days after the family disappeared, Merritt consistently referred to Joseph in the past tense, saying things like, "Joseph was my best friend," rather than "Joseph is my best friend." This linguistic detail became a red flag for investigators. How could Merritt be so certain that Joseph was dead unless he knew something that he had not shared with police? Detectives also discovered that Merritt's cell phone had pinged towers near the McStay family's home on February 4, 2010, which was consistent with his story about meeting Joseph for lunch. But more troubling was evidence that his phone had also pinged a cell tower in the Mojave Desert area around the same time period. Cell phone tower data is not precise enough to pinpoint an exact location, but the evidence suggested that Merritt's phone had been in the general area where the bodies were eventually found. This was difficult to explain if Merritt had nothing to do with the murders. Even more damaging evidence was found when investigators tested the McStay family's Isuzu Trooper, which had been in police storage since it was found near the Mexican border in 2010. DNA testing revealed that Merritt's DNA was present on the steering wheel and gear shift of the vehicle. Merritt's defense would later argue that his DNA could have been in the car from previous occasions when he rode with Joseph to business meetings. However, the presence of his DNA, combined with the cell phone evidence and his suspicious statements, created a pattern that investigators found compelling. On November 7, 2014, nearly a year after the bodies were discovered, Charles Chase Merritt was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of the McStay family. He was also charged with special circumstances that made him eligible for the death penalty. The arrest of Charles Merritt sent shockwaves through the communities of Fallbrook and the broader San Diego area. For nearly 4 years, people had wondered what happened to the McStay family, and many had held on to hope that they were alive somewhere in Mexico. The discovery of their bodies and the arrest of someone they trusted was devastating for everyone who knew the family. Merritt maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest. He told anyone who would listen that he could never hurt Joseph, Summer, or the children. He described Joseph as his best friend and insisted that he had no reason to harm the family. "I would never hurt him, never hurt Summer, Gianni, or Joseph Jr.," Merritt said in interviews. "He was my best friend. I loved Joseph. He was a big part of my life and my family's life." However, investigators had spent months building their case against Merritt, and they believed they had sufficient evidence to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution team was led by the San Bernardino County District Attorney's Office, and they were seeking the death penalty. The case presented several challenges for prosecutors. The bodies had been buried in the desert for nearly 4 years, which meant that much of the physical evidence had deteriorated. There were no witnesses to the actual murders, and much of the prosecution's case would have to rely on circumstantial evidence. But prosecutors believed they had built a strong case based on motive, opportunity, and physical evidence. They argued that Merritt had killed the family because Joseph was planning to cut him out of the fountain business, which would have cost Merritt his primary source of income. The financial motive became clearer as investigators dug deeper into Merritt's activities immediately after the family disappeared. They discovered that someone had written several checks from Joseph's business account in the days following February 4, 2010. The checks totaled more than $21,000 and were made out either directly to Merritt or to people that Merritt owed money. Even more suspicious was a phone call to Joseph's QuickBooks customer service department. Someone claiming to be Joseph McStay had called requesting that the entire business account be deleted, including all financial records and transaction history. The caller did not have the proper password to authorize such a deletion, so the request was denied. But investigators discovered that the phone call had been made from Charles Merritt's cell phone, not from any phone belonging to Joseph McStay. This suggested that Merritt was trying to cover his tracks by destroying evidence of the unauthorized financial transactions. Security cameras at several local casinos also showed Merritt gambling heavily in the weeks after the McStay family disappeared. He had spent thousands of dollars at slot machines and card tables, money that prosecutors believed he had stolen from Joseph's business account. The prosecution's theory of the case was that Merritt had lured the entire McStay family to a meeting on February 4th, possibly at their home or at another location. He had then killed all 4 family members with a sledgehammer, loaded their bodies into their own vehicle, and driven to the remote desert location where he buried them in shallow graves. After disposing of the bodies, Merritt had driven the family's SUV to San Ysidro near the Mexican border and abandoned it there. He had also conducted internet searches about Mexico and Spanish language learning on the family's computer to make it appear that they had voluntarily crossed the border. The prosecution argued that this was a carefully planned crime designed to eliminate Joseph McStay and steal money from his business while making it appear that the family had disappeared voluntarily. The plan had worked for nearly 4 years until the chance discovery of the bodies had exposed the truth. Merritt's defense team, led by attorney Rajan Maleen, argued that the evidence against their client was purely circumstantial and that there were other possible suspects who had not been thoroughly investigated. They pointed to other business associates of Joseph's who might have had motives to harm him. The defense also argued that the cell phone tower evidence was not precise enough to prove that Merritt had been at the burial site, and that his DNA in the family's vehicle could be explained by previous legitimate business trips with Joseph. Most importantly, the defense maintained that Merritt would not have killed Joseph because doing so would have cost him his livelihood. They argued that Merritt depended on Joseph's business for income and that killing him would have been financially self-destructive. The case was further complicated by Merritt's health problems and his tendency to fire his lawyers. Over the course of several years, he went through 5 different attorneys and repeatedly requested to represent himself. His poor health, including claims that he had only months to live, caused multiple delays in the trial proceedings. By the time the case finally went to trial in January 2019, more than 4 years had passed since Merritt's arrest. The long delay had given both sides time to prepare their cases thoroughly, but it had also meant prolonged uncertainty for the victims' family members. The trial of Charles Merritt began on January 7, 2019, in San Bernardino County Superior Court. It would prove to be one of the most closely watched murder trials in Southern California, drawing national media attention and public fascination with the mysterious case. The trial lasted more than 4 months and featured testimony from dozens of witnesses, including forensic experts, investigators, and people who had known both the McStay family and Charles Merritt. The prosecution presented their case methodically, building layer upon layer of circumstantial evidence to prove that Merritt was the killer. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence was the timeline of events on February 4, 2010. Cell phone records showed that Joseph had called Merritt 7 times after their lunch meeting, suggesting that there might have been some urgent business that needed to be discussed. The defense argued that Joseph would not have kept calling someone he had just fired, but prosecutors said this actually supported their theory that a confrontation was building. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony about Merritt's gambling addiction and financial desperation. Casino security footage showed him gambling away thousands of dollars in the weeks after the family disappeared, money that prosecutors said came from checks he had fraudulently written from Joseph's business account. Expert testimony about the cell phone tower data placed Merritt's phone in the general area of the Mojave Desert graves around the time the murders occurred. While the technology was not precise enough to pinpoint an exact location, the evidence was consistent with the prosecution's theory that Merritt had driven to the desert to bury the bodies. The defense team fought hard to create reasonable doubt, arguing that the evidence was not strong enough to support a conviction for such a serious crime. They pointed to other possible suspects and highlighted inconsistencies in the investigation. They also emphasized that no one had actually seen Merritt commit the murders or dispose of the bodies. However, after deliberating for about a week, the jury reached their verdict on June 10, 2019. They found Charles Merritt guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom was packed with family members and supporters, and there were emotional reactions as the verdict was read. The conviction was followed by a penalty phase to determine whether Merritt should receive the death penalty or life in prison without parole. During this phase, family members of the victims gave heartbreaking testimony about the impact of the murders on their lives. Joseph's mother, Susan Blake, addressed Merritt directly during her victim impact statement. "You are a despicable, evil monster," she told him. "How could you beat 2 precious little babies? How scared were they, Chase? Crying for mommy and daddy? Chase, you are a low-life baby killer." Michael McStay, Joseph's brother, spoke about the loss of his brother and the 2 young nephews he would never see grow up. "The world was robbed of 4 beautiful souls," he said through tears. On June 24, 2019, the same jury that had convicted Merritt recommended that he be sentenced to death. The final sentencing was scheduled for January 2020, giving the defense team time to prepare motions and appeals. During the sentencing hearing on January 21, 2020, Merritt made his final statement to the court, continuing to maintain his innocence. "I did not do this thing," he said, with his voice shaking. "I loved Joseph. He was a big part of my life and my family's life. I would never have hurt him in any way. I would have never raised my hand for a woman or child." Despite his protests, San Bernardino County Superior Court Judge Michael Smith upheld the jury's recommendation and sentenced Merritt to death. However, California had implemented a moratorium on executions in 2019, meaning that Merritt would likely spend the rest of his life on death row rather than actually being executed. Merritt was transferred to San Quentin State Prison to await the lengthy appeals process that is standard in death penalty cases. His defense attorney immediately announced plans to appeal the conviction, arguing that the case had been built on circumstantial evidence and that errors during the trial had prevented Merritt from receiving a fair hearing. The resolution of the case brought some measure of closure to the McStay family's loved ones, but it also raised questions about how the initial investigation had gone so wrong. For nearly 4 years, law enforcement had believed that the family was alive in Mexico, when in reality they had been murdered and buried in the California desert. The San Diego Sheriff's Department faced criticism for their handling of the early investigation. Critics argued that detectives had too quickly accepted the theory that the family had voluntarily disappeared, and that they had not thoroughly investigated other possibilities. The case also highlighted the limitations of surveillance technology and cell phone data in solving crimes. While these tools had ultimately helped convict Merritt, They had also led investigators astray in the early stages of the case, when blurry border-crossing video convinced them the family had gone to Mexico. For the Fallbrook community, the resolution of the case was both satisfying and deeply sad. Justice had been served, but it could not bring back the 4 innocent lives that had been lost or repair the damage that had been done to their sense of security. The case became a cautionary tale about trust and betrayal. The McStays had welcomed Merritt into their lives and their business, giving him opportunities despite his criminal history. Joseph had tried to help Merritt succeed, but prosecutors argued that greed and desperation had ultimately turned him into a killer. The story of the McStay family murders was featured in numerous television documentaries, podcasts, and true crime programs. The case captured public attention because it combined elements that fascinated audiences: a mysterious disappearance, a remote desert burial site, and the betrayal of trust by someone close to the victims. One of the most comprehensive examinations of the case was the investigation discovery series, Two Shallow Graves, which aired in 2022. The 7-part documentary provided unprecedented access to both the prosecution and defense teams, offering viewers an in-depth look at how the case was built and tried. The documentary raised questions about whether Merritt was truly guilty or whether he had been wrongly convicted based on circumstantial evidence. While the jury had found the evidence convincing enough to convict, some viewers and legal experts continued to debate whether justice had truly been served. The McStay family murders also had a lasting impact on criminal justice procedures in California. The case demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence for extended periods, as the breakthrough in the case only came when investigators were able to test DNA from the family's vehicle years after it had been impounded. The long delay between the murders and the discovery of the bodies also highlighted challenges in prosecuting cases where physical evidence has degraded over time. Forensic experts had to work with skeletal remains that had been buried in harsh desert conditions for nearly 4 years. For Charles Merritt's family members, the conviction brought its own form of tragedy. His daughter and other relatives continued to maintain his innocence and vowed to support his appeals. They argued that he had been made a scapegoat for a crime that remained unsolved, and that the real killer was still at large. The case file for the McStay family murders remains one of the largest in San Bernardino County history, containing thousands of pages of documents, photographs, and evidence. The investigation had cost taxpayers millions of dollars and had involved hundreds of law enforcement officers over nearly a decade. Today, the location where the McStay family was buried has been marked by memorial crosses placed by community members who wanted to honor their memory. The remote desert site has become a place of pilgrimage for people who followed the case and were moved by the tragedy. The McStay family's story serves as a reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places. Joseph and Summer McStay trusted Charles Merritt and welcomed him into their business and their lives. They had no way of knowing that financial desperation and gambling addiction would allegedly turn him into someone capable of murdering an entire family. The case also demonstrates the persistence required to solve complex crimes. It took nearly 4 years from the time the bodies were discovered until Merritt was convicted, and the investigation required the coordination of multiple law enforcement agencies across several counties. While justice was ultimately served in the McStay family murders, the case remains a tragedy that destroyed multiple families and shattered a peaceful community's sense of security. The loss of Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr. created a void that can never be filled, no matter how many legal proceedings take place. The legacy of the McStay family lives on in the memories of those who loved them and in the lessons learned from the investigation that followed their deaths. Their story continues to serve as both a tribute to their lives and a warning about the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly normal relationships. As Charles Merritt sits on death row in San Quentin, questions about the case continue to be debated by legal experts and true crime enthusiasts. Whether he is truly guilty of the murders or was wrongly convicted based on circumstantial evidence may never be definitively resolved to everyone's satisfaction. But for the family members who lost Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr., the most important thing is that someone has been held accountable for their deaths. The McStay family's story may have ended in tragedy, but their memory continues to live on in the hearts of all who knew and loved them. So there you have the McStay family murders, a case that started as a mysterious disappearance and ended with the discovery of 4 bodies buried in shallow graves in the Mojave Desert. For nearly 4 years, investigators believed the family had voluntarily crossed into Mexico, but the truth was far more sinister. Charles Merritt, Joseph's trusted business partner, had bludgeoned the entire family to death with a sledgehammer over financial disputes and gambling debts. Despite leaving behind cell phone records, DNA evidence and forged checks totaling over $21,000, Merritt maintained his innocence even after being sentenced to death. The case showed how someone close to a family could plan and execute such a brutal crime while successfully hiding the evidence for years. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the Lynn family murders, Australia. On July 18, 2009, 5 members of the Lynn family were found bludgeoned to death in their Sydney home. Robert Shee, the uncle-in-law, was eventually convicted after 4 trials, but questions remain about how he could have carried out such a savage massacre with so little direct physical evidence. Contextual overview. North Epping, in Sydney's northwest suburbs, was the kind of quiet Australian neighborhood where families felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. Tree-lined streets, neat front gardens, and the gentle hum of suburban life made it an ideal place to raise children and build a future. For the Lynn family, this peaceful community represented everything they had worked toward since arriving in Australia. Min Lin was 45 years old and the embodiment of the immigrant success story. He had come to Australia with big dreams and the determination to build a better life for his family. Min owned and operated a news agency in nearby Epping, a bustling little business that had grown into a cornerstone of the local community. Customers knew him as Norman, the friendly news agent who always had a smile and remembered their names. The news agency was more than just a business. It was Min's pride and joy, generating around $1 million in revenue each year. He sold newspapers, magazines, lottery tickets, and all the small necessities that kept the community connected. Min worked long hours, often opening early in the morning and staying late to serve his loyal customers. His wife Yun Lee Lin, who went by the English name Lily, was 43 years old and shared Min's dedication to their family's success. She helped run the news agency alongside her real estate work, always making sure the business ran smoothly. Lily was known for her warm personality and her devotion to her children's education and future. The couple had 3 children who were the center of their world. Their eldest was 15-year-old Jun Lin, who went by the name Brenda at school. Brenda was a bright, ambitious student at the prestigious Cheltenham Girls' High School, where she excelled in her studies and was well liked by her teachers and classmates. 12-year-old Henry was the middle child, a sweet boy who loved spending time with his family and playing with his younger brother. He was close to his uncle Robert Sia and often looked up to him as a father figure. 9-year-old Terry was the baby of the family, full of energy and always ready with a smile that could light up any room. Living with the Lin family was Lily's sister, 9-year-old Yun Bin Lin, who went by the name Irene. She had never married and devoted herself to helping her sister's family succeed. Irene worked at the news agency and helped take care of the children, especially when Min and Lily were busy with business responsibilities. The Lin family lived at 55 Amperes Boundary Road, a comfortable 2-story home that represented their hard-earned success. The house was neat and well-maintained, with separate bedrooms for each family member and enough space for everyone to feel at home. It was the kind of house that immigrant families dream about when they first arrive in a new country. Just 200 meters away, around the corner on Beck Street, lived Min's sister Kathy and her husband Robert Shee. The 2 families were extremely close, sharing frequent dinners, celebrations, and the everyday moments that bind extended families together. The children often played between the 2 houses, and the adults regularly helped each other with various tasks and responsibilities. Kathy Lin had married Robert Shee several years earlier, and while their relationship seemed stable from the outside, there were underlying tensions that most family members tried to ignore. Robert was a complex man with a troubled past and growing resentments that he kept largely hidden from view. Lian Bin Shi, who went by the English name Robert, was 47 years old and struggling with his place in Australian society. Back in China, he had been a successful ENT doctor with status and respect in his community. In Australia, however, his medical qualifications were not recognized, and he found himself unable to practice the profession that had defined his identity. After arriving in Australia in 2006, Robert had initially settled in Melbourne, where he attempted to open a restaurant. The business venture had failed miserably, costing him money and pride. The failure had been particularly humiliating because it came at a time when his brother-in-law Min was achieving tremendous success with his news agency business. Following the restaurant failure, Robert and Kathy had moved to Sydney to be closer to her family. Robert had been essentially unemployed since the move, depending on Kathy for financial support and feeling increasingly emasculated by his inability to contribute meaningfully to their household income. The contrast between Robert's situation and Min's success created a growing source of resentment and jealousy. While Min was thriving as a business owner, respected by his community and financially secure, Robert felt like a failure who had lost his status and professional identity. In traditional Chinese culture, face and social standing are extremely important, and Robert's inability to achieve success in Australia was a constant source of shame and frustration. He watched his successful brother-in-law with growing bitterness, feeling that Min looked down on him and that the family treated him as a second-class member. The financial disparity between the families was stark and obvious. The Lin family owned their home, which was worth approximately $1.2 million, plus a $300,000 unit in Maryland's, and the successful news agency business. Robert and Kathy, by contrast, were struggling financially and depending on Min's generosity for support. But Robert's resentments went beyond money and status. There was something darker and more disturbing about his relationship with the Lin family, particularly with his teenage niece Brenda. Unknown to most family members, Robert had developed an inappropriate sexual obsession with the 15-year-old girl. The Friday evening family dinners at the grandparents' home in Maryland's were weekly traditions that brought the extended family together. These gatherings were supposed to be celebrations of family unity and Chinese culture, with Mrs. Zhu's pork and sticky rice as the evening's highlights. But for Robert, these dinners had become reminders of his inferior position within the family hierarchy. At these family gatherings, Robert would often sit quietly, feeling excluded from conversations and decision-making processes. In Chinese culture, sons-in-law are sometimes viewed as half-members of the family, and Robert felt this status keenly. He believed that Min and other family members treated him with less respect than he deserved. The weekly routine was predictable. The extended family would gather at the grandparents' house in Maryland's, enjoy dinner together, and then return to their respective homes before 10 p.m. Robert and Kathy would often give rides to family members, including dropping off Min's children at their house on Boundary Road. But on July 17, 2009, this routine family evening would be the last time the Lin family would ever be together alive. Someone was making plans that would shatter this peaceful suburban community and destroy multiple lives forever. As the family prepared to leave the dinner that evening, they had no idea that within hours, 5 of them would be brutally murdered in their beds, victims of a rage and jealousy that had been building for years in someone they trusted completely. Friday, July 17, 2009, began like countless other Friday evenings for the extended Lin family. The weekly dinner at the grandparents' house in Maryland's was a cherished tradition that brought everyone together to share food, conversation, and the bonds that held their Chinese-Australian family together. The dinner that evening was typical in every way. Mrs. Zhu had prepared her famous pork and sticky rice dishes that everyone loved. The conversation flowed between English and Cantonese as family members caught up on the week's events, discussed business matters, and shared stories about the children's activities at school. Robert Shi sat at the table with his wife Kathy, participating in the conversation but seeming somewhat distant and preoccupied. Family members would later remember that he appeared normal that evening, showing no signs of agitation or unusual behavior that might have warned them of what was to come. Notably absent from the dinner were Lily and her sister Irene, who were working late at the news agency. This was not unusual. The women often missed family dinners when the business demanded their attention, especially on busy Friday evenings when customers were picking up weekend newspapers and lottery tickets. As the evening progressed, the family began preparing to leave and return to their respective homes. The routine was well established. Robert and Kathy would give rides to family members who needed transportation, and everyone would be home by 10 p.m. to prepare for the weekend ahead. Robert and Kathy drove Min's children, 12-year-old Henry and 9-year-old Terry, back to the house on Boundary Road. The boys were tired from the evening out and ready to settle in for the night. Min followed in his own vehicle, planning to pick up Lily and Irene from the news agency and bring them home. At approximately 10:30 p.m., Robert and Kathy dropped the boys off at their house and said goodnight. This would be the last time anyone saw Henry and Terry alive. The boys went inside, probably expecting to see their mother and aunt return home soon with their father. Min arrived at the news agency to collect Lily and Irene, who had been handling the evening's business and preparing to close for the night. The 3 of them drove home together, arriving at Boundary Road sometime around 11 p.m. The family was now reunited for what they expected to be a peaceful night's sleep. What happened over the next few hours would shock Australia and become one of the country's most brutal family massacres. But the exact timeline and sequence of events remains a subject of debate and controversy, with some experts questioning whether the prosecution's version of events was physically possible. According to the prosecution's theory, Robert Shi returned home with his wife Kathy and went to bed as usual. However, prosecutors alleged that he had given Kathy some form of sedative to ensure she would sleep deeply and not notice his absence from their bed. The sedation theory was crucial to the prosecution's case because Kathy maintained throughout all 4 trials that Robert had been in bed beside her all night. If she was correct, then Robert could not have committed the murders. But prosecutors argued that he had drugged her to create the perfect alibi. However, no physical evidence of sedation was ever found. No drugs were discovered in Kathy's system, no medication was found in their home, and no witnesses ever testified to seeing Robert obtain or administer sedatives. The entire sedation theory was based on the prosecution's need to explain away Robert's apparent alibi. According to the prosecution's timeline, Robert waited until Kathy was deeply asleep, then quietly left their bed and walked the 200 meters to the Lynn family home. He would have known the house intimately, having visited countless times over the years for family gatherings and social visits. The killer gained entry to the house without forcing any doors or windows, suggesting that he had a key or that the family had left the house unlocked. Given the Lynn family's trusting nature and the safe neighborhood, an unlocked door was entirely plausible. Once inside, the killer moved through the house with the confidence of someone who knew its layout perfectly. He knew where each family member slept, he knew the location of the electrical circuit breaker, and most importantly, he knew that 15-year-old Brenda was away on a school trip to New Caledonia with Cheltenham Girls High School. The killer's first action was to cut the electricity to the house, plunging it into darkness. This tactical decision suggested careful planning and a desire to disorient the victims while maintaining the advantage of surprise. What happened next was a scene of unimaginable brutality that would haunt investigators for years. Armed with what police believed to be a hammer-like weapon purchased from a discount store, the killer moved from room to room, systematically murdering each family member. The attack was savage and sustained, with the killer bludgeoning each victim multiple times. The injuries were so severe that police initially thought a shotgun had been used. The victims' faces were so badly damaged that forensic analysis was required to identify them. Min and Lily were attacked in their master bedroom, where they were sleeping peacefully after their long day of work. The killer struck them repeatedly with the blunt weapon, causing massive head injuries that would have been quickly fatal. In the second bedroom, Irene was murdered in her bed. She had been living with the family for years, helping with the business and the children, and had no reason to expect violence from someone she trusted. The most heartbreaking part of the massacre occurred in the boys' bedroom, where 12-year-old Henry and 9-year-old Terry were killed as they slept. The killer showed no mercy for the children, bludgeoning them with the same brutal force used against the adults. Forensic analysis revealed that 4 of the 5 victims also showed signs of asphyxiation, suggesting that the killer may have used pillows or other means to ensure they were dead. The combination of bludgeoning and suffocation indicated a level of rage and determination that shocked even experienced homicide investigators. The crime scene was awash with blood, with spatter patterns on walls and ceilings throughout the house. The killer had tracked bloody footprints from room to room, leaving evidence of his movements as he systematically eliminated each family member. Significantly, Brenda's room was left completely untouched. The killer never entered her bedroom, despite the fact that it was part of his path through the house. This suggested that he knew she was away on the school trip and was specifically sparing her from the massacre. After completing the murders, the killer faced the challenge of disposing of the murder weapon and cleaning up evidence that might link him to the crime. He took the hammer-like weapon with him, and it was never recovered despite extensive police searches. The killer also attempted to clean up some of the evidence, though the massive amount of blood made complete cleanup impossible. He left behind footprints, DNA evidence, and other traces that would eventually help investigators build their case. According to the prosecution's theory, Robert Shee then returned to his home on Beck Street, disposed of the murder weapon in an unknown location, and cleaned his garage to remove any evidence that might have been transferred from the crime scene. The next morning, Robert was up early, cleaning his garage with unusual thoroughness. Neighbors would later testify that this behavior was somewhat unusual, though not necessarily suspicious at the time. Meanwhile, customers began gathering outside the Lynn family's news agency, wondering why the normally reliable business was still closed well past its usual opening time. Main event. Saturday morning, July 18, 2009, began with an unusual sight at the Lynn family news agency in North Epping. By 9 a.m., a small crowd of regular customers had gathered outside the shop, puzzled by the fact that it remained closed. This was completely out of character for Min Lin, who was known for his reliability and dedication to serving his customers. Min's news agency was a vital part of the local community's daily routine. People came every morning to buy newspapers, check lottery tickets, and purchase the small items that made their days run smoothly. The fact that the shop was still locked up on a Saturday morning was enough to worry his regular customers. Among those trying to reach the family was Kathy Lynn, Min's sister, who had been receiving phone calls from confused customers asking why the news agency was closed. She tried calling the Lynn family home multiple times but got no answer, which was also unusual since someone was almost always there to pick up the phone. Growing increasingly concerned, Kathy asked her husband Robert to come with her to check on her brother's family. At around 9:50 a.m., the couple walked the short distance from their home on Beck Street to the Lynn family house on Boundary Road, a journey that took less than 5 minutes. When they arrived at 55 Amperes Boundary Road, Kathy noticed that something felt wrong immediately. The house was too quiet, with no signs of the normal morning activity that usually characterized the busy Lynn household. She called out but received no response from inside. Kathy tried the front door and found it was unlocked, which was not necessarily unusual given the family's trusting nature and the safe neighborhood. She pushed the door open and called out again for her brother and sister-in-law, but the silence that greeted her was ominous and frightening. According to the official account, both Kathy and Robert entered the house together to search for the family members. They climbed the stairs to the second floor, where the bedrooms were located, continuing to call out for Min, Lily, and the children. What they discovered in the master bedroom was a scene of unthinkable horror. Min and Lily were lying in their bed, covered in blood and clearly dead from massive head injuries. The amount of blood was overwhelming, soaking the bedding and spattered across the walls and ceiling. Kathy's immediate reaction was shock and panic. She began screaming and struggling to process what she was seeing. The injuries to her brother and sister-in-law were so severe that their faces were barely recognizable, beaten beyond identification by someone who had attacked them with savage fury. Moving to the second bedroom, they found Irene's body, also bludgeoned to death in her bed. The 9-year-old woman who had devoted her life to helping her sister's family had been murdered with the same brutal efficiency as the others. In the boys' bedroom, the most heartbreaking discovery awaited them. 12-year-old Henry and 9-year-old Terry had been killed as they slept in their beds. The sight of the murdered children was more than Kathy could bear, and she collapsed into hysterics. At 10:06 a.m., Kathy made a frantic 000 call to emergency services, though she was so distraught that she could barely communicate what had happened. The emergency operator struggled to understand her through her tears and shock, but eventually dispatched police and ambulances to the scene. During this chaotic period, Robert Shee made a decision that would later be viewed with suspicion by investigators. Instead of staying at the crime scene to help his wife and wait for police to arrive, he insisted on leaving to pick up Min and Kathy's elderly parents from their home in Marylands. Robert's explanation was that the grandparents needed to be informed about the tragedy and brought to the scene. However, investigators would later theorize that this gave him a crucial window of time to dispose of the murder weapon and any other evidence that might link him to the crime. The 30-minute drive to Marylands and back provided Robert with the perfect opportunity to stop at any number of locations to dispose of evidence. The murder weapon was never found despite extensive searches, and investigators believe this trip was when Robert got rid of it permanently. When police and paramedics arrived at the Boundary Roadhouse, they were confronted with one of the most brutal crime scenes in Australian criminal history. The level of violence was shocking even to experienced homicide investigators who had seen countless murder scenes throughout their careers. Detective Inspector Chris Olin, who was placed in charge of the investigation, immediately recognized that this was not a random crime or a burglary gone wrong. The systematic nature of the killings, the intimate knowledge of the house layout, and the fact that nothing had been stolen all pointed to someone with a personal connection to the family. The crime scene analysis revealed several important clues. Bloody footprints throughout the house matched a particular model of athletic shoe in a men's size 8.5. The footprints showed a clear path from the master bedroom to the children's room, indicating the killer's movements through the house. The blood spatter patterns were consistent with a hammer-like weapon being used repeatedly on each victim. The force of the blows was so intense that blood had been sprayed from floor to ceiling in multiple rooms, creating a scene that required extensive forensic analysis to understand. Significantly, there was no evidence of forced entry anywhere in the house. All doors and windows were intact, suggesting that the killer had used a key, or that the family had left the house unlocked. This immediately focused suspicion on people who had access to the home. Another crucial detail was that Brenda's bedroom had not been entered at all. Despite being part of the killer's logical path through the house, her room was completely undisturbed. This suggested that the killer knew she was away on her school trip and had deliberately avoided her room. The electrical circuit breaker had been switched off, plunging the house into darkness during the attack. This tactical decision showed planning and forethought, as it would have given the killer a significant advantage over his sleeping victims. Forensic analysis of the victims revealed that the killer had used tremendous force in the attacks. Min Lin's injuries were so severe that investigators initially thought he might have been shot with a firearm. The repeated blows to each victim's head showed a level of rage and hatred that went far beyond what would be necessary to simply kill them. 4 of the 5 victims showed signs of asphyxiation in addition to their head injuries, suggesting that the killer may have used pillows or other means to ensure they were dead. This methodical approach indicated that the murders were not spontaneous acts of violence, but carefully planned executions. The attack had occurred sometime between 11 p.m. on July 17th and 2 a.m. on July 18th, based on the victims' last known activities and the condition of their bodies when discovered. This timing would become crucial in establishing alibis for potential suspects. Within hours of the discovery, Strike Force Norburn was established to coordinate what would become one of Australia's largest and most complex murder investigations. More than 100 detectives would eventually work on the case, interviewing hundreds of witnesses and following thousands of leads. The news of the massacre sent shockwaves through the North Epping community and across Australia. The Lynn family had been well-known and respected members of their neighborhood, and the brutal nature of their deaths created widespread fear and revulsion. Media coverage of the case was extensive and intense, with reporters camping outside the crime scene and speculating about possible motives and suspects. The fact that an entire family had been wiped out in such a savage manner captured public attention and demanded justice for the victims. Immediate aftermath. The discovery of the Lynn family massacre sent shockwaves rippling through the peaceful suburb of North Epping and across Australia. Within hours, the quiet residential street was transformed into a major crime scene, with police cars, forensic vans, and media trucks lining Boundary Road. Detective Inspector Chris Olin took charge of the investigation and immediately recognized that this was unlike any crime he had encountered in his career. The systematic nature of the killings, combined with the extreme violence used against each victim, indicated that this was a deeply personal attack carried out by someone with intimate knowledge of the family. The crime scene was so extensive and complex that forensic investigators spent days processing every room, collecting blood samples, fingerprints, and any other evidence that might help identify the killer. The house became a sealed environment where every surface was photographed, measured, and analyzed for clues. One of the most significant early discoveries was a series of bloody footprints that created a clear path through the house. The impressions were made by a men's athletic shoe, size 8.5, and showed exactly how the killer had moved from room to room during the massacre. These footprints would later become crucial evidence in the prosecution's case. The absence of any signs of forced entry immediately focused the investigation on people who had legitimate access to the Lynn family home. Police began interviewing family members, friends, business associates, and anyone else who might have had a key to the house or known that it was sometimes left unlocked. 4 days after the murders, on July 22, 2009, police conducted their first formal interviews with Kathy and Robert Shee. As the people who had discovered the bodies and the closest family members geographically, they were obvious witnesses who needed to provide detailed statements about their movements and observations. During these initial interviews, Kathy appeared calm and composed, providing clear answers about the events of that morning and her family's recent activities. She expressed shock and grief at the loss of her brother and his family, but was able to communicate effectively with investigators. Robert Shee's behavior during the interviews was markedly different. He appeared nervous and agitated, avoiding eye contact with the detectives and struggling to form complete sentences, even when speaking in Cantonese with a translator present. His obvious discomfort raised some initial suspicions, though police recognized that people react differently to trauma and shock. The investigation quickly expanded to examine the Lynn family's business relationships, financial situation, and personal connections. Detectives wanted to determine if the murders might have been related to business disputes, gambling debts, or other criminal activities that could have motivated such extreme violence. However, investigators found no evidence of any significant problems in the Lynn family's life. Their news agency business was successful and legitimate. They had no known enemies, and their financial situation was stable and secure. The family appeared to have been well liked by their community and free from the kinds of conflicts that might lead to violence. The randomness of the crime scene also seemed to rule out robbery as a motive. Nothing had been stolen from the house, and valuable items were left untouched throughout the property. If robbery had been the goal, the killer would have taken electronics, jewelry, or cash, but none of these items were missing. As months passed without any arrests or major breakthroughs, public pressure on police to solve the case continued to mount. The brutal nature of the crimes and the fact that an entire family had been wiped out made this a case that demanded justice, and the media coverage remained intense throughout the investigation. In May 2010, nearly a year after the murders, investigators decided to conduct extensive surveillance of potential suspects, including Robert Shee. This surveillance operation would prove to be the turning point in the case, though it would take another year before arrests were made. During the surveillance period, police observed Robert Shee cutting up what appeared to be a shoebox for Asics sneakers and flushing the pieces down his toilet. This behavior was particularly significant because the bloody footprints at the crime scene had been consistent with Asics athletic shoes in the same size that Robert wore. The surveillance also revealed other potentially suspicious behaviors, including Robert's apparent attempts to clean and organize areas of his home that might contain evidence. Police interpreted these actions as possible consciousness of guilt, though Robert's defenders would later argue that such behavior could have innocent explanations. The most crucial breakthrough came when forensic investigators conducted a detailed search of Robert Shee's garage in May 2010. During this search, they discovered a tiny stain on the concrete floor that measured just 2 centimeters by 6 millimeters. This minuscule mark, which came to be known as Stain 91, would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Initial testing suggested that Stain 91 was blood, though this would later be disputed by defense experts. More importantly, DNA analysis indicated that the stain contained genetic material from at least 4 of the 5 murder victims. The presence of the victim's DNA in Robert Shee's garage was extremely difficult to explain through innocent means. The prosecution's theory was that Stain 91 was a transfer stain, created when Robert returned to his garage after committing the murders. They argued that he had blood on his clothing, shoes, or the murder weapon, and that some of this blood had dripped onto the garage floor where it was later discovered by investigators. However, the discovery of Stain 91 also raised troubling questions about the investigation. The stain was incredibly small and had been missed during earlier searches of the garage. Some critics wondered whether such a tiny amount of evidence could really support a conviction for 5 murders, especially when no other significant physical evidence linked Robert to the crime scene. On May 5, 2011, nearly 2 years after the murders, Robert Shee was arrested at his home in North Epping. The arrest was conducted without incident, with Robert offering no resistance as he was taken into custody and charged with 5 counts of murder. The charges against Robert Shee created a sensation in the Australian media and legal community. Here was a case that had captured national attention, and police were finally claiming to have identified the killer who had brutally murdered an entire family. Kathy C's reaction to her husband's arrest was one of complete shock and denial. She maintained that Robert had been in bed beside her on the night of the murders and that he could not possibly have committed such terrible crimes. Her unwavering support for her husband would continue throughout the lengthy legal proceedings that followed. Long-term repercussions. The arrest of Robert Shee began what would become one of the most complex and controversial murder trials in Australian legal history. The case would ultimately require 4 separate trials over a span of more than 7 years before a final verdict was reached, highlighting the challenges prosecutors faced in proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The first trial was scheduled to begin in September 2013, but it was quickly abandoned when new evidence was introduced that had not been properly disclosed to the defense team. This early setback demonstrated the complexity of the case and the massive amount of evidence that prosecutors were attempting to manage. The second trial began in August 2014, but was also abandoned in September due to health issues affecting the presiding judge. These repeated delays were frustrating for the victims' families, who desperately wanted to see justice served for their murdered relatives. The third trial commenced in February 2015 and lasted for 9 months, making it one of the longest murder trials in New South Wales history. The prosecution presented their case methodically, relying heavily on circumstantial evidence to build their argument that Robert Shee was the killer. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was Stain 91, the tiny blood stain found in Robert Shee's garage. Advanced DNA analysis by the American company Cybergenetics had reportedly identified genetic material from 4 of the 5 victims in this microscopic sample. Prosecutor Mark Tedeschi described it as probably the most complex DNA sample ever introduced to a criminal trial in Australia. However, the DNA evidence was not as straightforward as it initially appeared. Expert witnesses provided conflicting testimony about whether the stain was actually blood, how the DNA had gotten there, and whether the testing methods were reliable enough to support such serious criminal charges. Defense attorneys argued that the DNA could have been transferred to the garage floor through innocent means, given that the 2 families lived only 200 meters apart and frequently visited each other's homes. Children from both families often played together, and it was entirely plausible that genetic material could have been transferred through normal social interaction. The prosecution also presented evidence about Robert Shee's alleged motive for the murders. They argued that he had been consumed by resentment over his perceived inferior status within the Lin family and his failure to achieve success in Australia after being a respected doctor in China. More controversially, prosecutors suggested that Robert had developed an inappropriate sexual obsession with his teenage niece, Brenda Lin. This alleged obsession had supposedly motivated him to eliminate her family so that she would be forced to live with him and his wife, giving him greater access to the girl. The sexual motive allegations were particularly damaging because Brenda Lin eventually came forward to testify that Robert had indeed sexually abused her after she moved in with him and Kathy following the murders. This testimony added a deeply disturbing dimension to the case and helped establish a possible motive for the killings. However, the defense team argued that there was no credible evidence to support the prosecution's theories about motive. They pointed out that Robert had maintained good relationships with all the family members and had been particularly close to his nephew Henry, whom he treated like a son. The defense also emphasized Robert's alibi, RT2, that he had been in bed beside his wife Kathy throughout the night of the murders. Kathy testified consistently across all 4 trials that Robert had been with her and could not have committed the crimes. The prosecution's response was to claim that Robert had sedated his wife, but no evidence of sedation was ever found. After 11 days of deliberation, the jury in the 3rd trial was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. 2 separate notes from the jury indicated they could not agree on Robert's guilt or innocence, despite Justice Elizabeth Fullerton's indication that she would accept a majority verdict of 11-1. The judge was forced to discharge the jury, resulting in another mistrial. Robert Shee was granted bail in December 2015, allowing him to return home while awaiting his 4th trial. This decision was controversial, given the serious nature of the charges, but the court recognized that he had already spent years in custody without a conviction. The 4th and final trial commenced in June 2016, with both sides presenting refined versions of their previous arguments. The prosecution continued to rely on Stain 91 and the circumstantial evidence surrounding Robert's behavior, while the defense maintained that the evidence was insufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. On January 12, 2017, after 8 days of deliberation, the jury reached a majority verdict of guilty on all 5 counts of murder. The decision was 11-1, meaning that 1 juror maintained doubts about Robert's guilt even after extensive deliberation. When the verdict was announced, Robert C. rose to his feet in the dock and proclaimed his innocence. "I did not murder the Lin family. I am innocent," he declared to the courtroom. His wife, Kathy, broke down in tears, continuing to support her husband despite the conviction. On February 13, 2017, Justice Elizabeth Fullerton sentenced Robert Shee to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge noted the extreme brutality of the crimes and the fact that the victims had included 2 young children who were defenseless against their attacker. Robert C. immediately appealed his conviction, arguing that the evidence was insufficient and that errors during the trial had prevented him from receiving a fair hearing. However, his appeal was dismissed by the New South Wales Court of Appeal in February 2021, upholding the trial court's verdict. The Lin family murders case had a profound impact on the Australian legal system, particularly regarding the use of complex DNA evidence in criminal trials. The case demonstrated both the power and the limitations of forensic science in solving crimes where physical evidence is limited. The case also raised important questions about the burden of proof in criminal trials and whether circumstantial evidence alone should be sufficient to support convictions for such serious crimes. Legal experts continue to debate whether the evidence against Robert Shee was truly sufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. For Brenda Lin, the sole survivor of her family, the conviction brought some measure of closure but could not restore what she had lost. By 2017, she had graduated from the University of Sydney and was working to rebuild her life after the trauma of losing her family and being sexually abused by the man who was supposed to protect her. Brenda has since become an advocate for survivors of sexual abuse and family violence, using her experience to help others who have faced similar trauma. She has spoken publicly about the importance of believing survivors and providing. So there you have the Lin family murders, too, a case that took 4 trials and over 7 years to reach a conviction. Robert Shee, a former doctor struggling with his status in Australian society, was found guilty of bludgeoning 5 family members to death with a hammer-like weapon in their North Epping home. The prosecution's case hinged on a tiny blood stain called Stain 91 found in Shee's garage, containing DNA from 4 of the victims. Despite his wife's alibi that he was in bed beside her all night, prosecutors argued he had sedated her to commit the murders. The savage brutality of the crime, irony, faces so disfigured they required forensic analysis to identify, shocked Australia. but questions remain about whether such limited physical evidence was sufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt in one of the country's most complex murder cases. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the Alday Family Massacre, Georgia, 1973. The Alday Family Massacre, Number 2. In this video, we're going to be breaking down one of the most shocking family massacres in American history that detectives still remember as one of the most brutal crimes they ever investigated. Let's get started with the story of the Alday Family Massacre. Key point. On the 14th of May, 1973, 6 members of the Alday family were murdered, execution-style on their rural Georgia farm by 4 escaped convicts who had stopped looking for gasoline. The senseless brutality of the killings shocked the nation and marked the end of an era when people in rural communities felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. Seminole County, Georgia, in the early 1970s, was farming country where families had worked the same land for generations. Located in the southwestern corner of the state, near the Florida border, it was the kind of place where nobody locked their doors and everyone knew their neighbors. The Alday family were hardworking, God-fearing people who embodied everything good about rural Georgia life. 62-year-old Ned Alday was the family patriarch who had spent his entire life working the land. He was respected throughout Seminole County as a man of his word who would help his neighbors without being asked. Ned's wife Ernestine was the heart of the family, keeping the household running while supporting the farming operation. She was active in their local church, Spring Creek Baptist Church, which Ned had helped build with his own hands. 35-year-old Jerry Alday lived in a mobile home on the family property with his 25-year-old wife Mary. Jerry was known as a gentle, hard-working man who had inherited his father's dedication to the land. Mary was beloved by everyone who knew her and had become an essential part of the Alday family. Jerry's brothers were equally dedicated to the family business. 24-year-old Jimmy Alday was the youngest of Ned's sons, full of energy and always ready to tackle whatever job needed doing on the farm. At 30, Chester "Shuggy" Alday was known for his mechanical skills. The extended family included Ned's brother, 58-year-old Aubrey Alday, who lived nearby and worked closely with his brother's family. Aubrey was a bachelor who had devoted his life to farming and helping Ned raise his sons. The Alday farm was a typical operation for rural Georgia in the 1972. They grew corn and soybeans while raising cattle. The property included Ned's main house, Jerry and Mary's mobile home, and what appeared to be a gas pump near Jerry's trailer that was actually an irrigation pump for the farm's water system. Spring Creek Baptist Church was the center of the Alday family's spiritual life. The Spring Creek community was the kind of place where children could play outside until dark and neighbors helped each other during planting and harvest seasons. The Alday family had no enemies that anyone knew of. They minded their own business, helped their neighbors when asked, and expected to live out their lives in the same peaceful community where they had been born and raised. The story of the 4 men who would destroy the Alday family began with Carl Isaacs, who was 19 years old in May 1973. Carl had grown up in a chaotic family with 12 children by multiple fathers. The family moved constantly as relationships fell apart and poverty drove them from place to place. Carl spent much of his childhood in foster homes and reform schools. By the time he was a teenager, he was already a seasoned criminal with arrests for burglary and theft. In March 1973, Carl was assaulted and gang-raped by older inmates during a prison riot that took over his cell block, leading prison officials to transfer him to the Poplar Hill prison camp for his safety. This brutal assault left him traumatized and filled with rage. At Poplar Hill, he reunited with his half-brother Wayne Coleman, who introduced him to George Dungy. Wayne Coleman was 26 years old and serving time for his own criminal activities. Wayne had also grown up in the same chaotic household, moving between foster homes and juvenile facilities. George Elder Dungy was a 35-year-old man who was serving time for failing to pay child support. Coleman had developed what prison officials described as a romantic relationship with Dungy. Coleman and Carl Isaacs planned an escape from Poplar Hill after deciding they would likely not be paroled from their sentences early. Their ultimate goal was to reach Florida because Wayne Coleman wanted to see the ocean. Meanwhile, Carl's youngest brother, 15-year-old Billy Isaacs, had been sent to the Victor Cullen School for Boys after an arrest for burglary. Billy was different from his older brothers. He still had dreams and seemed to want to turn his life around. In April 1973, Billy Isaacs escaped from that reform school. He had been doing well in school and had even found a girlfriend who gave him hope for a better future. On the 5th of May, 1973, the events which would culminate in the massacre began at the Poplar Hill Correctional Institute outside of Baltimore, Maryland. Carl Isaacs, Wayne Coleman, and George Dungy made their escape by crawling out of a dormitory bathroom window. The three men hid in nearby woods before stealing a car and driving to Baltimore to pick up Billy Isaacs. Prison authorities did not immediately alert local police because the three inmates were not considered particularly dangerous. This proved to be a fatal mistake. When the three arrived at Billy's girlfriend's house, they forced the 15-year-old to come with them. Billy did not want to go, knowing that traveling with his criminal brothers would only lead to trouble, but Carl bullied and threatened him until he agreed. Somehow, Wayne Coleman also obtained a .38 caliber pistol. The four men began driving south, committing burglaries and robberies along the way to fund their trip to Florida. On May 10, they kidnapped 9-year-old Richard Wayne Miller in McConnellsburg so they could steal his Chevrolet Chevelle. They drove into Flintstone, Maryland, where Coleman dragged Miller out of the car and murdered Miller by shooting him in the head. Richard Wayne Miller was a good Samaritan who gave chase when he recognized the truck as belonging to his neighbor. His act of civic responsibility cost him his life. Miller's body was discovered on the 3rd of June 1973, almost 1 month later. By the 14th of May 1973, the four escapees had been on the road for 9 days, growing more desperate with each passing day. They were running out of money, their stolen car was low on gasoline, and they were beginning to realize their dream of reaching Florida might not work out. Around 4 p.m. on the 14th of May, 1973, the four men were driving through Seminole County when they spotted what looked like a gas pump on Ned Alday's property. The pump they thought they saw was actually an irrigation pump used for farming, but from the road, it looked like exactly what they needed. The four criminals had stumbled onto a family farm where multiple generations had built their lives through honest work and Christian values. They had no idea that their random decision to stop at this property would result in one of the most shocking mass murders in American history. Before we continue with what happened next, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. On the 14th of May, 1973, Coleman and Carl Isaacs entered Jerry Alday's mobile home while their two companions, George Dungy and Billy Isaacs, remained outside initially. What they thought was a gas pump turned out to be an irrigation pump, but they decided to burglarize the trailer anyway. George Dungy remained in the car as a lookout, while Carl and Wayne broke into the mobile home. Billy Isaacs was torn between his fear of his criminal brothers and his growing realization that he was part of something spiraling out of control. Inside the trailer, the two men ransacked rooms looking for money, guns, and anything of value. Jerry and Mary Alday lived modestly, like most farming families, but the criminals were desperate enough to take whatever they could find. Several members of the Alday family began to arrive shortly thereafter. When Ned and Jerry Alday drove up in a Jeep, Coleman, Carl Isaacs, and Billy Isaacs forced the two to enter the home. Jerry and his father Ned were returning home after having lunch with Jerry's mother Ernestine at the main family house. It was a typical afternoon routine, two lunch together, then back to work on the farm. Jerry and Ned had no reason to suspect anything was wrong as they pulled up behind the mobile home. In rural Georgia in 1973, unexpected visitors were not unusual. Neighbors often stopped by to borrow tools or ask for help. Carl Isaacs came out of the trailer to confront the two men as they got out of their Jeep. Armed with the .38 caliber pistol, Carl ordered Jerry and Ned into the trailer at gunpoint. The two farmers, realizing they had stumbled into a robbery, complied without resistance. What happened next transformed a simple burglary into a massacre. Instead of simply robbing the two men and fleeing, Carl Isaacs and Wayne Coleman made the decision to eliminate witnesses. Carl forced Jerry Alday into the south bedroom, while Wayne took Ned Alday to the north bedroom. Both victims were ordered to lie face down on the beds before being shot, execution style in the back of the head. The killings were cold, calculated, and completely unnecessary. The sounds of gunshots should have warned anyone else away, but the next family member was already approaching. Jerry's brother Jimmy arrived at the trailer on a tractor, and he too was led inside and forced to lay on a couch, then shot. Jimmy had knocked on the trailer door and called out for his brother, unaware that Jerry was already dead inside. Carl opened the door and forced Jimmy into the trailer at gunpoint. The youngest of Ned's sons was led into the living room and shot to death. 3 members of the Alday family were now dead, but the killing was far from over. Mary Alday was returning home from her job in Donaldsonville, expecting to find her husband Jerry and probably looking forward to a quiet evening together. Carl met Mary at the door and forced her into the trailer where she discovered the horrific scene. The 25-year-old woman was forced into the bathroom while the killers debated what to do with her. Before they could decide, another vehicle pulled into the driveway. Chester Shuggy Alday was arriving with his uncle Aubrey Alday, probably coming to check on Jerry or discuss farm business. The two men had no idea they were driving into a death trap. Carl and Billy went outside to confront Chester and Aubrey while they were still in their pickup truck. The two family members were ordered into the trailer at gunpoint, where they joined Mary in discovering the bloody aftermath. Wayne Coleman took Chester into the north bedroom and shot him execution style, while Carl led Aubrey into the south bedroom and killed him the same way. 5 members of the Alday family were now dead, shot in the head at close range. But the criminals were not finished with Mary Alday. Mary Alday was raped on her kitchen table before being taken out to a wooded area miles away, where she was raped again and then finally murdered. After assaulting her in the trailer, the 4 men decided to take Mary to a remote location where they could abuse her further. They forced her into Miller's stolen Chevrolet and drove several miles to a heavily wooded area in neighboring Early County. In those isolated woods, Mary was raped again by the men who had already murdered her husband, father-in-law, and 3 other family members. When they were finished, George Dungy shot her in the back, completing one of the most brutal crimes in Georgia history. The killers left Mary's body in the woods and drove away in her 1970 Chevrolet Impala. They now had 6 murders on their consciences, but showed no signs of remorse as they continued their flight toward Florida. Crime scene investigators determined that the killers used 4 different guns in the murders. This suggested a level of preparation and ruthlessness that went beyond a simple robbery gone wrong. This was systematic murder committed by people who had completely abandoned any connection to human decency. The entire massacre had taken place over just a few hours on what had started as a normal May afternoon for the Alday family. 6 people who had been alive and looking forward to the future that morning were now dead. When Ned, Jimmy, Aubrey, and Chester Alday had not returned to their respective homes, Ned's wife Ernestine called relatives who lived near Jerry's trailer. Chester's wife Barbara went to check on them but found no one home and assumed the trailer was empty because there were no cars nearby. The absence of multiple family members continued to worry the surviving Aldays throughout the evening. These were people who maintained regular contact and always let family know if their plans changed. At 2:30 a.m. on the 15th of May, 1973, Barbara, Ned's surviving brother Bud Alday, and Bud's son Roy revisited Jerry's trailer. Roy and Bud gained entry and immediately found one victim's body on a couch. Afterwards, they returned to Bud's house and called a sheriff at 2:45 a.m. The sheriff discovered the 5 male victims' bodies and summoned the Georgia Division of Investigation for assistance. Inside the mobile home, investigators found 5 Alday family members, all shot execution style in the head. The amount of blood was overwhelming, covering floors, walls, and furniture throughout the small trailer. The sheriff realized his small-town department was not equipped to handle such a massive crime scene. Within hours, the property was swarming with state investigators and forensic experts. As Mary Alday's body was left in the wooded area where she had been kidnapped and murdered, investigators discovered her body later on, May 15, hours after they discovered the men's bodies. The condition of her body told the horrific story of her final hours. The discovery of 6 murder victims sent shockwaves through Seminole County and across Georgia. This was not the kind of crime that happened in rural farming communities where everyone knew their neighbors. Word of the murders spread quickly through the tight-knit community, creating a level of fear that had never existed in Seminole County before. For the first time in memory, people began locking their doors. The sense of safety and trust that had defined rural Georgia life was gone forever. Within days, investigators connected the Alday murders to other crimes committed along the route from Maryland to Georgia. The discovery of Richard Miller's body and reports of various burglaries helped establish a timeline pointing to escaped convicts. The manhunt for the Alday killers became one of the largest in Georgia history, involving hundreds of law enforcement officers from multiple states. Roadblocks were established throughout the Southeast. Funeral services for the 6 victims were held on the 17th of May, 1973, with hundreds of community members attending. The sight of 6 coffins in the small church was almost too much for the grief-stricken community to bear. The manhunt came to an end on the 18th of May, 1973, when West Virginia State Police captured all 4 suspects at a roadblock near Lewisburg. The men were carrying 3 weapons that investigators would connect to the Alday murders. Before we dive into the legal battle that followed, make sure to subscribe for more true crime content. West Virginia officials transported the 4 by plane to Atlanta on May 19. All 4 of the defendants were indicted on 6 counts of murder on the 4th of September 1973. Billy Isaacs cooperated with prosecutors and received a 40-year sentence for armed robbery and burglary. The youngest of the 4 testified against his brothers and their accomplice in exchange for the reduced sentence. Carl Isaacs, Coleman, and Dungy were tried by jury in Seminole County in 1973, convicted, and sentenced to death. The evidence was overwhelming, and jury deliberations were brief. reflecting the community's demand for the ultimate punishment. However, the death sentences would not be carried out for decades due to legal challenges. All 3 convictions and sentences were overturned by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit in 1985, on the grounds that the pool of local jurors had been tainted by excess pretrial publicity. The appeals court ruling was devastating for the Alday family survivors and the community, who had waited more than a decade to see justice served. All 3 killers would have to be retried. All 3 defendants were retried in 1988 and were again convicted. However, only Carl Isaacs was sentenced to death, Coleman and Dungy receiving life sentences. The retrials took place far from Seminole County. Carl Isaacs was executed by lethal injection on the 6th of May, 2003, 30 years after the murders. At the time of his execution, at age 49, he was the longest-serving death row inmate anywhere in the U.S., having spent 30 years on death row. His death also marked the first time in Georgia history that victimized family members were allowed to witness a death sentence being carried out. 3 members of the extended Alday family witnessed the execution. More than 60 relatives were outside the prison after arriving in a caravan of 6 cars and a bus. "It's 200 miles from Donaldsonville to Jackson, Georgia, but it's taken us 30 years to get here," said Paige Seagraves, Ned Alday's granddaughter. George Dungy died of a heart attack in prison in 2006 at age 68. Wayne Coleman is still living at the expense of Georgia taxpayers at the Wilcox State Prison. He continues to be eligible for parole, but it continues to be denied. Billy Isaacs served 20 years before being paroled in 1993. He moved to Florida and tried to build a new life away from the notoriety. He died in 2009 at age 51. The impact of the Alday murders extended far beyond the immediate victims. Before the 14th of May, 1973, almost no one around had locks on their doors, and those who did never used them. The murders changed that forever. The family farm was eventually sold because there was no one left to work it. The property that had been in the Alday family for generations became the final casualty of the murders. The case also led to significant changes in victims' rights. Paige Barber, Ned Alday's granddaughter, successfully lobbied for passage of the Alday Family Bill in 2003, which requires the state to update victims' families twice a year about developments in death penalty cases. For the surviving family members, the murders created wounds that never fully healed. Relda King, who remembers her father Aubrey Alday, said, "My dad was a nice man. He worked hard, played hard." Speaking about Wayne Coleman, she said, "May you rot in hell. That's all I've got to say." While 6 were murdered that day, the actions of those evil men led to the death of another. Great effort was made to keep Mary Alday's mother from learning the terrible details of how her child was killed. But on the 18th of May 1973, the day after the funerals, she learned the truth. The shock was too much to bear, and she died shortly after. The murders were the subject of an award-winning 1977 documentary called Murder One and a 1988 film starring Henry Thomas. The film was widely released but not shown in Southwest Georgia so as not to offend people. Today, more than 50 years later, the Alday family name is still remembered throughout Southwest Georgia. With the senseless killing of 6 members of one family, this mass murder is second in Georgia history, only to the 6th of August, 1887, Woolfolk murders. The case continues to be studied as an example of how random violence can destroy entire families and communities. The systematic nature of the killings and the complete lack of remorse shown by the perpetrators make it one of the most chilling mass murders in American criminal history. The Spring Creek Baptist Church that Ned Alday helped build still serves the farming families of Seminole County, standing as a reminder of the values the Alday family lived by and died for. The Alday family massacre stands as one of the most brutal and senseless crimes in American history. What started as 4 escaped convicts looking for gasoline turned into the execution-style murders of 6 innocent people who had the misfortune of coming home at the wrong time. The case changed rural Georgia forever, ending an era of trust and open doors in small farming communities. Carl Isaacs spent 30 years on death row before his execution in 2003, becoming the longest-serving death row inmate in the United States. The surviving family members never found true closure, and the case continues to serve as a reminder of how random violence can destroy entire families and communities in just a few hours. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the Clutter family murders. On the 15th of November 1959, 4 members of the Clutter family were brutally murdered in their farmhouse in Holcomb, Kansas by 2 ex-convicts who had driven 400 miles across the state to steal money from a safe that didn't exist. The senseless killings shocked rural America and became the subject of Truman Capote's groundbreaking true crime book, In Cold Blood. Holcomb, Kansas in 1959 was the kind of small farming town where people never locked their doors and everyone knew their neighbors. Located in Finney County in western Kansas, about 7 miles from the county seat of Garden City, Holcomb was surrounded by wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. It was a place where the biggest excitement might be the Friday night high school football game and where violent crime was almost unheard of. The Clutter family represented everything good about rural American life in the 1,950 seconds. Herbert "Herb" Clutter was 48 years old and one of the most respected men in Finney County. He was a college graduate, a successful wheat farmer, and a community leader who could always be counted on to lend a helping hand to his neighbors. Herb owned River Valley Farm, a prosperous operation that covered several hundred acres of prime Kansas farmland. He was known throughout the area as a hard-working, honest businessman who paid his bills on time and treated his employees fairly. Herb was also deeply religious and didn't drink alcohol or allow smoking on his property. He conducted most of his business by check rather than cash, which he believed was a more organized and honest way to handle transactions. Bonnie Mae Clutter was Herb's 5-year-old wife, a gentle woman who had struggled with depression and anxiety for several years. Despite her health challenges, she was devoted to her family and tried to maintain a normal household routine. Bonnie had been in and out of hospitals seeking treatment for her mental health issues, but she always returned home to care for her husband and children. The Clutter children were typical teenagers of the 1,950 seconds, involved in school activities and looking forward to bright futures. Nancy Mae Clutter was 16 years old and a junior at Holcomb High School. She was a straight-A student who played clarinet in the school band and was active in the local 4-H club. Nancy was popular with her classmates and was known for her kindness and willingness to help others with their schoolwork. Kenyon Neal Clutter was the youngest child at 15 years old and a sophomore in high school. Like his sister, Kenyon was a good student who stayed out of trouble. He was interested in mechanical things and enjoyed working on an old pickup truck that his father had allowed him to buy, even though he was too young to have a driver's license. Kenyon was also active in 4-H and enjoyed hunting and woodworking. The family also had 2 older daughters who were away from home at the time of the murders. Beverly was married and living in Kansas City, while Eviana was attending college at Kansas University in Lawrence. Both girls had grown up on the farm and maintained close relationships with their parents and younger siblings. The Clutter farmhouse was a large, comfortable 2-story home that reflected the family's prosperity and good taste. It had modern appliances and was well maintained, sitting on a rise overlooking the farm's wheat fields. The house was surrounded by outbuildings including barns, equipment sheds, and quarters for farm workers. Life in Holcomb moved at the steady pace of agricultural seasons. Spring meant preparing fields and planting wheat. Summer brought cultivation and maintenance of crops. Fall was harvest time, when the entire community worked together to bring in the grain that would support their families through winter. Winter was for planning next year's crops, maintaining equipment, and spending time with family and neighbors. The community was tight-knit, with most families attending one of several churches in town. Social events revolved around school activities, church functions, and farm-related gatherings. Crime was virtually unknown. The most serious problems might involve teenage pranks or occasional disputes between neighbors over property lines. The Clutters had no enemies and no reason to fear for their safety. Herb was involved in no business disputes, owed no money, and had no known conflicts with anyone in the community. The family lived quietly and peacefully, contributing to their community and looking forward to watching their younger children graduate from high school and start their own adult lives. Nobody in Holcomb could have imagined that their peaceful world was about to be shattered by 2 strangers who had driven across Kansas with murder on their minds. The collision between the decent, hard-working Clutter family and 2 desperate ex-convicts would create one of the most shocking crimes in American history. The story of the men who would destroy the Clutter family began in the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, where 2 very different criminals had formed an unlikely partnership. Harry Edward Smith was 31 years old in 1959, a short, stocky man with a troubled past that had shaped him into a dangerous individual. Perry had grown up in a broken family that moved constantly across the American West. His father was an abusive alcoholic who abandoned the family when Perry was young. His mother struggled with alcoholism and was unable to provide a stable home for her children. Perry and his siblings were shuffled between orphanages, foster homes, and relatives who didn't want them. By the time he was a teenager, Perry had learned to survive on his own through petty crime and violence. He had been in and out of juvenile institutions and had developed a deep hatred for authority figures. Perry was intelligent and well-read, but his violent temper and criminal tendencies had prevented him from making anything positive of his life. Perry had served time for burglary and other crimes before ending up in the Kansas State Penitentiary. While in prison, he met Richard Eugene "Dick" Hickok, who became his closest friend and criminal partner. The two men spent hours planning crimes they would commit after their release. Dick Hickok was 28 years old and came from a very different background than Perry. Dick had been born to God-fearing parents in eastern Kansas and had grown up on a farm. He was considered above-average intelligence and had been a good athlete in high school, dreaming of a college football scholarship that never materialized. After high school, Dick had worked at various jobs including railroad worker, auto mechanic, and ambulance driver. He had married and started a family, but his desire for easy money and excitement had led him into a life of crime. Dick was a smooth talker who could charm people, but underneath his friendly exterior was a cold, calculating criminal mind. Dick had been sentenced to the penitentiary for theft and forgery. While serving his sentence, he became friends with Perry Smith and another inmate named Floyd Wells. It was Wells who would unknowingly set in motion the events that would lead to the Clutter family murders. Floyd Wells had worked as a farmhand for Herb Clutter in 1948 and had gotten to know the family during his employment. While in prison, Wells talked about his experiences working for the Clutters, describing them as wealthy farmers who kept large amounts of cash in a home safe. Wells's description of the Clutter family's supposed wealth caught Dick Hickok's attention. Dick began asking detailed questions about the family, the layout of their house, and especially about the safe, where Wells claimed Herb Clutter kept $10,000 in cash. Wells described the Clutter home and told Dick about the family's routines and habits. In reality, Wells's information was completely wrong. Herb Clutter was prosperous, but not wealthy, and he certainly didn't keep large amounts of cash around the house. Herb conducted all his business by check and rarely had more than a few dollars in cash on hand. There was no safe in the Clutter home, and Herb would have thought it foolish and dangerous to keep thousands of dollars in his house. But Dick Hickok didn't know that Wells was wrong. Based on the false information, Dick began planning what he called the perfect score. He envisioned driving to the Clutter farm, stealing the money from the safe, and leaving no witnesses who could identify him to police. Dick shared his plan with Perry Smith, who was initially skeptical but eventually agreed to participate. Perry was facing a longer prison sentence and was desperate for money to start a new life somewhere far from Kansas. The two men decided that after the robbery, they would flee to Mexico, where they could live comfortably on the stolen money. Dick Hickok was paroled on the 13th of August 1959 and went to live with his parents while looking for work. He got a job at Bob Sands's garage in Olathe, Kansas, working as an auto mechanic. During this time, he wrote several letters to Perry Smith, who was still in prison, discussing their plans for the Clutter robbery. Perry Smith was released from prison several weeks after Dick and initially went to Nevada to visit his sister. But Dick's letters convinced him to come to Kansas to participate in the robbery. Perry traveled to Kansas and met Dick in Olathe, where they finalized their plans for what they expected to be an easy score. The two men spent time preparing for the crime. Dick obtained a 12-gauge shotgun and an 8-inch hunting knife, which he planned to use to intimidate the Clutter family into revealing the location of the safe. They also gathered rope, tape, and other supplies they thought they would need. On the afternoon of the 14th of November 1959, Dick and Perry left Olathe in a borrowed 1949 Chevrolet and began the 400-mile drive to Holcomb. They took a roundabout route, stopping for gas and food along the way while discussing their plan. Both men were nervous but excited about the prospect of stealing what they believed would be a large amount of money. As they drove through the Kansas countryside, Dick and Perry had no idea that their intended victims were completely innocent people who had done nothing to deserve what was about to happen to them. They also didn't know that the information they were acting on was completely false and that there was no safe and no $10,000 waiting for them at the Clutter farm. The two ex-convicts arrived in Garden City around midnight on the 15th of November, 1959, and stopped at a Phillips 66 gas station to fill up their car. From there, it was just a short drive to Holcomb and then to the dirt road that led to the Clutter farmhouse. As they approached their destination, both men were tense with anticipation, not knowing that they were about to commit one of the most senseless and brutal crimes in American history. Before we continue with what happened that night, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown of one of America's most notorious crimes. At approximately 1 a.m. on the 15th of November, 1959, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith arrived at the Clutter farmhouse near Holcomb, Kansas. They parked their borrowed 1949 Chevrolet in the driveway on the west side of the house and sat for a moment, gathering their courage for what they were about to do. Dick carried his hunting knife, and Perry carried the 12-gauge shotgun as they approached the house. They had expected to find the doors locked, but when Dick tried the west door, it opened easily. The Clutters, like most rural Kansas families in 1959, saw no reason to lock their doors in their safe, peaceful community. The two intruders entered the house quietly, using a flashlight to guide them through the dark rooms. They immediately began searching for the safe that Floyd Wells had told them about, checking Herb Clutter's small paneled office on the first floor. But after searching through papers and looking behind pictures on the walls, they found no safe. Their search became less careful as they grew more desperate. The noise they made, moving around the house, eventually awakened Herb Clutter, who was sleeping in his bed on the first floor. When Herb opened his eyes, he found himself staring into the beam of a flashlight held by a stranger. Dick Hickok ordered Herb out of bed at gunpoint and forced him into his office, where he demanded to know where the safe was located. Herb was confused by the question and explained that he had no safe and kept no large amounts of cash in the house. He offered to write them a check and give them whatever cash he had in his wallet if they would leave his family alone. The two criminals were shocked to discover that their information was wrong. There was no safe and no $10,000 in cash. But they had come too far to leave empty-handed, and Dick had already told Perry that they needed to leave no witnesses who could identify them to police. Over the next 2 hours, the situation in the Clutter house became increasingly desperate and violent. Dick and Perry forced Herb to wake up the rest of his family and gather them together. Bonnie Clutter was roused from her bed and brought downstairs, along with Nancy and Kenyon. The family was terrified but tried to cooperate with their captors, hoping that the men would take whatever they wanted and leave. Herb repeatedly told them that he had no safe and conducted all his business by check. He offered to give them whatever money he had and write them a check for more if they would just leave his family unharmed. But Dick Hickok had not driven 400 miles across Kansas to leave with empty hands. He became increasingly angry as it became clear that the robbery was not going to go as planned. Perry Smith, who was known for his violent temper and unpredictable behavior, also became more agitated as the night wore on. The two criminals decided to separate the family members to prevent them from helping each other or trying to escape. They tied up Bonnie Clutter and put her to bed in a room on the second floor, taping her mouth shut but leaving her hands tied in front of her body. Nancy was also tied up and put to bed in her own room, but for some inexplicable reason, the killers did not gag her. Herb and Kenyon were taken to the basement, where they were tied up in the furnace room. Kenyon was gagged, and his hands were tied behind his back, with the rope then tied to an overhead steam pipe. Herb was also restrained, though accounts differ on exactly how he was positioned. After searching the house thoroughly and finding only about $40 in cash, plus Nancy's radio and a pair of binoculars, the two criminals faced a decision. They could take the small amount of money and valuables they had found and flee, hoping that the Clutter family would not be able to provide good descriptions to police. Or they could follow through on Dick's plan to leave no witnesses. Unfortunately for the Clutter family, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith chose murder. The exact sequence of events remains disputed, as both men later blamed each other for the actual killings. But court records and Truman Capote's investigation established the basic facts of what happened next. Perry Smith later claimed in his oral confession that Dick Hickok murdered Nancy and Bonnie upstairs, shooting each woman in the head with the shotgun. However, when asked to sign his confession, Smith refused. According to Capote's account, Smith wanted to accept responsibility for all 4 killings because he felt sorry for Dick's mother, whom he described as a real sweet person. Dick Hickok always maintained that Perry Smith committed all 4 murders, and most evidence suggests that this version was closer to the truth. Perry was known for his explosive temper and history of violence, while Dick was more of a schemer who preferred to avoid direct confrontation when possible. In the basement, Herb Clutter was brutally murdered in a particularly savage manner. Perry Smith slit his throat with Dick's hunting knife and then shot him in the head with the shotgun. Kenyon, just 15 years old, was shot in the head while lying on a sofa in the basement, a pillow placed under his head in what seemed like a final gesture of mercy. Upstairs, Nancy and Bonnie Clutter were each killed by single shotgun blasts to the head. The killers had shown no mercy to any member of the family, murdering 4 innocent people for less than $50 in cash and a few small items that they thought they could sell. The entire ordeal lasted several hours, from the time the killers entered the house until they finally left after committing the murders. By dawn on the 15th of November, 1959, 4 members of the Clutter family were dead, victims of one of the most senseless and brutal crimes in American history. Dick Hickok and Perry Smith loaded their few stolen items into their car and drove away from the Clutter farmhouse, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would shock the nation. They had gotten away with less than $50 and some small valuables, but they had destroyed an entire family and shattered the sense of safety and security that had defined rural Kansas for generations. The two killers drove east toward Edgerton, Kansas, stopping at a roadside park to burn their blood-stained clothing and gloves. They reached Olathe about 11 a.m. on Sunday morning, where Perry registered at a hotel under a false name, while Dick went to his parents' home to establish an alibi. Neither man showed any remorse for what they had done. They had committed 4 brutal murders for almost no gain, destroying the lives of innocent people who had never done anything to harm them. Their crime would become one of the most studied and written about murders in American history, but for the Clutter family, there would be no coming back from that terrible night in November 1959. The bodies of the Clutter family were discovered on the morning of Sunday, the 15th of November, 1959, when Nancy's friends came to pick her up for church. The Clutters were regular churchgoers, and when Nancy failed to appear for Sunday services, her friends became concerned and went to the farmhouse to check on the family. Susan Kidwell, one of Nancy's closest friends, and her father arrived at the Clutter home around 10 a.m. and found the west door unlocked. When they called out and received no answer, they became worried and decided to enter the house. What they found was a scene of horror that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The discovery of 4 murdered family members sent shockwaves through the small farming community of Holcomb. This kind of violent crime simply didn't happen in rural Kansas, where people trusted their neighbors and never locked their doors. The brutal nature of the murders and the fact that the killers had apparently gained nothing significant from their crime made the killings even more disturbing. Sheriff Earl Robinson and his deputies arrived at the scene within minutes of being called, but they quickly realized that their small-town law enforcement agency was not equipped to handle such a massive investigation. The Finney County Sheriff's Department had never investigated anything more serious than burglaries and cattle theft. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation was immediately called in to assist with the case. KBI agent Alvin Dewey took charge of the investigation and began the painstaking process of examining the crime scene and interviewing potential witnesses. The scene told a story of systematic murder carried out by killers who had shown no mercy to their victims. The condition of the bodies revealed the brutal nature of the crimes. Herb Clutter had been nearly decapitated by the knife wound to his throat, and all 4 victims had been shot at close range with a shotgun. The fact that the family members had been separated and restrained showed that the killers had spent considerable time in the house before committing the murders. The small amount of money and valuables that had been taken suggested that robbery was the motive, but investigators were puzzled by the extreme violence used against victims who had apparently offered no resistance. The killers had murdered an entire family for less than most people carried in their wallets. Word of the murders spread quickly through the farming communities of western Kansas and eastern Colorado. For the first time in memory, rural families began locking their doors and looking suspiciously at strangers. The sense of safety and trust that had defined life in small farming towns was gone forever. The funeral services for the 4 Clutter family members were held at the First Methodist Church in Garden City on the 18th of November 1959. Approximately 1,000 mourners packed the church, with many more standing outside. The sight of 4 coffins in the front of the church was almost too much for the grief-stricken community to bear. The victims were buried at Valley View Cemetery on the north edge of Garden City. Herb and Bonnie were buried side by side under a double headstone, with Nancy's grave to the left and Kenyon's to the right. The simple graves became a place of pilgrimage for people who wanted to pay their respects to the innocent family who had been so brutally murdered. The investigation initially focused on local suspects, as investigators found it hard to believe that strangers would drive hundreds of miles to commit such a crime. They interviewed hired hands who had worked for the Clutter family, business associates, and anyone who might have had a reason to harm Herb Clutter. But as days passed with no arrests, investigators began to realize they were looking for killers who had no connection to the Holcomb community. The systematic nature of the murders, and the fact that the killers had apparently known enough about the family to target them, suggested that someone had provided information about the Clutters to the murderers. The break in the case came when Floyd Wells, the former Clutter farmhand who was serving time in the Kansas State Penitentiary, heard about the murders on the radio. Wells realized that his stories about the Clutter family's supposed wealth had probably led to their deaths. Motivated partly by guilt and partly by a $1,000 reward that had been offered for information about the killers, Wells contacted prison officials. Wells told investigators about his conversations with Dick Hickok regarding the Clutter family. He described how Hickok had questioned him extensively about the family, their house, and the safe that Wells had incorrectly claimed contained large amounts of cash. Wells also told investigators that Hickok had talked about committing the robbery with his friend Perry Smith. Based on Wells's information, investigators were able to identify Dick Hickok and Perry Smith as the prime suspects in the Clutter family murders. Photographs of both men were distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country, and an intensive manhunt began. The search for the killers became one of the largest investigations in Kansas history. Police departments in dozens of states were alerted to watch for the two suspects, and their photographs were published in newspapers across the country. The brutal nature of the crimes and the innocent victims had captured national attention. Meanwhile, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith had fled Kansas immediately after the murders. They drove to Kansas City, where Dick cashed several forged checks before the two men decided to flee to Mexico. They sold Dick's car in Mexico City and lived there briefly before running out of money and returning to the United States. The two killers then began a cross-country crime spree, committing burglaries and passing bad checks as they moved from state to state. They traveled through California, back to Iowa where they stole another car, and then to Kansas City again before finally heading to Las Vegas, Nevada. On the 30th of December 1959, 6 weeks after the murders, Las Vegas police officers spotted a car with Kansas license plates parked outside the post office. When they ran the plates, they discovered the car had been reported stolen. The two men in the car matched the descriptions of Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. The arrest of the suspected killers brought relief to the terrified farming communities of western Kansas, but it also began a legal process that would continue for more than 5 years. The two men were extradited back to Kansas, where they would face trial for 4 counts of first-degree murder. Dick Hickok and Perry Smith were returned to Kansas on the 6th of January, 1960, where they were charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of the Clutter family members. Both men were held in the Finney County Jail in Garden City as they awaited trial. The case against the two suspects was strong. Floyd Wells provided testimony about Hickok's plans to rob the Clutter family. Physical evidence linked both men to the crime scene, including boot prints found at the house that matched boots in their possession when they were arrested. Most importantly, both men eventually confessed to being present during the murders, though each blamed the other for the actual killings. During questioning by KBI agents, Dick Hickok initially tried to deny any involvement in the murders. But when confronted with the evidence against him and told that Perry Smith was already talking, Hickok broke down and confessed. Weeping, he admitted to being present during the killings, but claimed that Perry had committed all 4 murders. Perry Smith also confessed, but his version of events differed from Hickok's account. Perry claimed that Dick had killed Nancy and Bonnie Clutter, while he had killed Herb and Kenyon. However, most investigators believed that Perry had committed all 4 murders, while Dick watched and assisted. The trial of Dick Hickok and Perry Smith began in March 1960 at the Finney County Courthouse in Garden City. The case attracted national media attention, with reporters from across the country covering the proceedings. The small courthouse was packed with spectators who wanted to see the men who had committed such brutal crimes. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They presented evidence showing that the defendants had traveled to the Clutter farm with the intention of committing robbery and had murdered 4 innocent people when they discovered there was no money to steal. The confessions of both defendants, along with physical evidence and witness testimony, made conviction almost certain. The defense attorneys tried to argue that their clients were mentally ill and should not be held fully responsible for their actions. They presented evidence of both men's troubled backgrounds and history of mental health problems. Perry Smith, in particular, had a history of head injuries and psychological issues that his lawyers argued had impaired his judgment. But the local doctors who examined the defendants found both men to be legally sane and capable of understanding the difference between right and wrong. The jury was not convinced by the insanity defense, particularly given the calculated nature of the crimes and the fact that both men had planned the robbery in advance. On the 29th of March 1960, after deliberating for just over an hour, the all-male jury returned verdicts of guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. Following Kansas law at the time, the same jury then had to decide whether the defendants should be sentenced to death or to life in prison. The jury recommended the death penalty for both Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. Judge Roland Tate formally sentenced both men to death by hanging, which was still the method of execution used in Kansas. The 2 convicted killers were transported to death row at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. For the next 5 years, Hickok and Smith lived on death row while their lawyers filed numerous appeals. The case made its way through state and federal courts as attorneys challenged various aspects of the trial and sentencing. The appeals process was lengthy and expensive, but ultimately unsuccessful. During their years on death row, both men continued to blame each other for the actual murders. Dick Hickok maintained that Perry Smith had killed all 4 family members, while Perry claimed that Dick had killed the 2 women. The The truth about exactly who pulled the trigger remained disputed, though most evidence suggested that Perry had committed all 4 killings. The case gained additional national attention when author Truman Capote began researching a book about the murders. Capote spent years interviewing everyone involved in the case, including the killers themselves. His resulting book, In Cold Blood, published in 1966, became one of the most famous true crime books ever written. Capote's book helped establish the murders as a turning point in American culture, marking the end of an era of innocence in rural America. The random, senseless nature of the killings showed that violence could strike anywhere, even in the most peaceful farming communities. On the 14th of April 1965, more than 5 years after the murders, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith were executed by hanging at the Kansas State Penitentiary. Dick was executed first at 12:41 a.m., followed by Perry at 1:19 a.m. Both men were 36 and 31 years old, respectively, at the time of their deaths. Dick Hickok's last words were spoken to KBI agent Roy Church, who had played a major role in their capture. "You're sending me to a better place than this," Hickok said, adding that he held no grudge against Church. Perry Smith asked that nothing be read over him during his execution, though a prison chaplain quietly prayed for his soul. The executions marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal cases in American history, but the impact of the Clutter family murders continued to be felt for decades. The case had changed how Americans thought about random violence and had helped establish the modern true crime genre. The surviving Clutter daughters, Beverly and Eviana, had to rebuild their lives after losing their entire immediate family. The family farm was eventually sold, as there was no one left to work the land that had been in the Clutter family for years. The murders also had a lasting impact on the community of Holcomb and the surrounding area. The sense of safety and trust that had defined rural Kansas life was permanently shattered. For the first time, farming families began locking their doors and looking suspiciously at strangers. In 2012, the bodies of Dick Hickok and Perry Smith were exhumed from Mount Muncie Cemetery as part of an investigation into the unsolved 1,959 murders of the Walker family in Florida. DNA testing was conducted to determine if the 2 men might have been responsible for those killings as well, but the tests were inconclusive. The Clutter family murders remain one of the most studied crimes in American history. The case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films beyond Capote's famous work. It continues to be taught in criminal justice classes as an example of how a thorough investigation can solve even the most challenging cases. Today, more than 60 years after the murders, the Clutter family is still remembered in Holcomb and the surrounding area. Their graves at Valley View Cemetery in Garden City remain a place where people come to pay their respects to 4 innocent people whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. The water tower in Holcomb still bears the Longhorn mascot of the local school, and the railroad tracks still divide the town. But the innocence that once defined this small farming community was lost forever on that November night in 1959, when 2 strangers came calling at the Clutter farmhouse with murder in their hearts. The Clutter family murders represent one of the most senseless and brutal crimes in American history. What started as a robbery based on completely false information ended with the execution-style murders of 4 innocent people who had done nothing more than live peaceful, productive lives in rural Kansas. The case marked the end of an era of trust and safety in small-town America and inspired Truman Capote's groundbreaking book, In Cold Blood. Dick Hickok and Perry Smith spent 5 years on death row before being executed in 1965, becoming among the last people hanged in Kansas. The murders continue to fascinate criminologists and true crime enthusiasts as an example of how random violence can destroy entire families and communities in a single night of terror. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.